Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. I'll be your guide through these glowing ruins, sharing quiet moments of hope, resilience, and the eerie calm of a world long gone. Welcome, fellow wanderer of the neon wasteland, to the complete saga of Benjamin, known simply as Benny, a man whose checkered jacket concealed ambitions vast enough to topple empires, and whose silver tongue spoke promises his cunning could not fulfill. Tonight, we explore the rise and fall of a tribal dreamer who reached for the stars of old Vegas and found only the bitter taste of consequence. So settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let the story wash over you like desert wind through casino halls. There's no need to remember every detail. Just let the rhythm of ambition and downfall carry you into peaceful slumber as we trace every step of the man who almost had it all. The Mojave wasteland that would shape Benny's destiny was not born overnight, but forged through centuries of nuclear fire, human desperation, and the slow, inexorable process of adaptation that transforms catastrophe into something resembling civilization. The world that emerged from the Great War of 2077 was a landscape of contradictions, where the elegant ruins of pre-war excess stood as monuments to humanity's capacity for both creation and destruction, their crumbling facades testament to the fragility of even the most carefully constructed social orders. The desert itself seemed to conspire with the forces of decay, its relentless sun bleaching bones and concrete alike, its sand gradually reclaiming the works of mankind with patient, geological persistence. Yet within this apparent desolation, life persisted with the stubborn tenacity that had always characterized the human species, finding purchase in the most unlikely places, adapting to conditions that would have seemed impossible to those who had lived before the bombs fell. The Mojave became a proving ground where only the strong, the clever, or the fortunate survived to see another sunrise over the red rocks and dead lakes. Water, always scarce in the desert even before the war, became the most precious commodity in this transformed world, its sources carefully guarded by those fortunate or violent enough to control them. Communities formed around springs and wells like iron filings drawn to magnets, their populations expanding and contracting with the reliability of water flow, their politics determined by the simple calculus of survival in an environment that offered no second chances to the weak or foolish. The Colorado River, that great artery of life that had sustained civilizations for millennia, continued its patient journey through the wasteland, its waters now tainted with radiation, but still capable of supporting those desperate or adapted enough to drink from its contaminated flow. The power vacuum left by the collapse of pre-war government created opportunities for new forms of social organization, some brutally similar not as inevitable realities, but as choices that could theoretically be unchosen. This was the psychological space where ambition was born in the wasteland, not from mere desire for power or resources, which even the most unimaginative raider possessed, but from the specific yearning to become something categorically different from one's origins. It was not enough to be a successful raider. The goal was to transcend the category of raider entirely, to remake oneself so completely that the tribal past would seem like something that had happened to a different person. This kind of ambition was rare because it required both exposure to alternatives and the imaginative capacity to envision personal transformation, qualities that tribal life actively discouraged through its emphasis on conformity and immediate practical concerns. Yet the Mojave, harsh as it was, created just enough space for these rare ambitions to germinate in certain minds. The fragments of the old world, providing the seeds of ideas that would eventually blossom into actions that would reshape the wasteland's political landscape. The man who would become Benny was shaped by this particular combination of tribal hardship and pre-war mythology. His consciousness expanded by encounters with remnants of a lost civilization, while his circumstances remained brutally limited by the realities of tribal existence. The tension between these two poles, between what he was and what he dreamed of becoming, would drive every significant decision of his life, leading him first to transformation and ultimately to catastrophe. His story, a testament to both the power of ambition and its terrible costs. The man who would become Benny was born into the Boot Riders during a period when the tribe had achieved a certain brutal stability in their claimed territories, their position secure enough that children could be raised to adulthood rather than perishing in the constant warfare that characterized less successful raider groups. His early years, though undocumented in any formal record, can be inferred from the cultural patterns of tribal life and the personality traits that would later define his character, suggesting a childhood marked by the usual violence and scarcity of wasteland existence, but also by an unusual capacity for observation and learning that set him apart from his peers, even in those formative years. The tribal camp where young Benny learned the basic skills of survival was a harsh but efficient environment. Its inhabitants focused on the practical necessities of securing food, water, and protection from the numerous threats that surrounded them on all sides. Children in such settings were not coddled or sheltered from the realities of wasteland existence, but rather exposed to violence and hardship from their earliest years, learning through observation and participation that life was cheap, that comfort was temporary, and that only the strong or clever survived to reproduce. Benny would have witnessed deaths from combat, disease, and simple accident with a regularity that would have numbed most children into accepting mortality as an ever-present companion. Yet even in this environment of normalized brutality, variations in temperament and capability emerged among the tribal youth, some embracing the raider lifestyle with enthusiasm, while others demonstrated talents that suggested different potentials. Benny appears to have been one of those rare children who possessed not just intelligence, which was common enough even among raiders, but a particular kind of social intelligence that allowed him to read people with unusual accuracy, to understand what motivated them, to predict their reactions, and adjust his own behavior accordingly. This capacity, combined with physical competence sufficient to avoid being marked as weak, allowed him to navigate tribal politics with greater success than many of his age mates. The tribal hierarchy that Benny learned to understand and manipulate was based on straightforward principles of dominance and utility, with the strongest warriors occupying positions of leadership and those who proved useful in supporting roles, finding protection in exchange for their services. Even as a youth, Benny demonstrated an aptitude for making himself valuable to those above him in the hierarchy, performing tasks with reliability and showing deference with just the right degree of sincerity to be convincing without appearing servile. This ability to manage perceptions, to present himself in ways that achieved desired outcomes, would become one of his defining characteristics, honed through years of practice in an environment where miscalculation could prove fatal. The tribal leader under whom Benny grew to maturity was a figure of absolute authority within the Boot Riders, his position maintained through a combination of physical prowess, strategic acumen in raiding operations, and the capacity for violence that kept potential challengers cowed into submission. This man, whose name has been lost to history, but whose influence on Benny's development was profound, represented a particular kind of wasteland leadership, charismatic in a crude way, effective in the limited sphere of tribal raiding, but ultimately constrained by the same limitations of vision and imagination that characterized most raider chiefs. Benny learned from this leader how power functioned in its most basic form, the lessons of dominance and submission that would inform his later, more sophisticated manipulations. Yet Benny's education extended beyond the formal and informal instruction provided by tribal life, encompassing also the self-directed learning that occurred when a curious mind encountered artifacts from the world that had been lost. The Boot Riders' territories included numerous ruins that had not been thoroughly scavenged, buildings that had once served purposes the tribe barely understood, filled with objects whose original functions were mysteries, but whose aesthetic qualities spoke of a very different kind of existence. It was in these ruins that Benny discovered the fragments of pre-war culture that would reshape his understanding of possibility, his conception of identity, his vision of what a human life might encompass beyond mere survival. The first suit he ever saw was on a mannequin in a collapsed department store, its fabric faded and degraded by decades of exposure, but still recognizable as a garment of refinement and deliberate style. The checkered pattern that would later become his signature caught his eye, not for any rational reason, but because it represented a level of aesthetic consideration completely absent from tribal life, where clothing was purely functional and style was limited to crude symbols of tribal affiliation. Benny stood before that mannequin for a long time during that scavenging expedition, his companions ransacking the store for anything of trade value while he simply stared at the suit, imagining what kind of person would wear such a thing, what kind of world would produce it. Books, when he learned to decipher the strange symbols that covered their pages, opened vistas of knowledge and possibility that tribal oral culture could never match. The process of teaching himself to read was painstaking and largely solitary, accomplished through trial and error with materials scavenged from ruins, comparing text to images in children's books, until the connection between symbol and meaning became clear. The act of reading itself became transformative, not just for the information it conveyed, but for what it represented: the ability to access knowledge across time and space, to learn from people long dead, to exist in mental landscapes completely removed from the immediate physical environment. A literate raider was a contradiction, an anomaly that suggested capacities beyond what tribal culture could accommodate or value. The holotapes he discovered and learned to play on scavenged equipment revealed even more striking contrasts between the old world and his own. The voices that emerged from these recordings spoke with accents and vocabularies utterly unlike the crude dialect of tribal communication. Their words shaped by education and confidence that came from living in a world where basic survival was not an all-consuming concern. Benny listened to these voices for hours, repeating phrases until he could approximate their cadence and pronunciation, consciously reshaping his own speech patterns to match what he heard, understanding instinctively that language was not just communication but identity, that how one spoke determined how one was perceived and treated. The cultivation of an image different from his tribal peers began as a private obsession, something Benny pursued in solitude because he understood that too much deviation from tribal norms would mark him as strange or weak. But gradually, as he matured and his position in the tribe became more secure, he began to allow hints of his self-directed education to show through in his interactions with others. He would use words he had learned from books in contexts where they impressed or confused his listeners. He would demonstrate knowledge of pre-war culture that exceeded what most raiders possessed. He would, when opportunities arose, display preferences for aesthetics and refinement that set him apart, while stopping just short of the line that would trigger tribal enforcement of conformity. The hunger for refinement in a crude world created a constant psychological tension for Benny, a sense of living in permanent exile from a place he had never actually inhabited but could vividly imagine. Every day spent in the tribal camp felt like a kind of imprisonment, not because the physical conditions were intolerable by wasteland standards, but because the people and others surprisingly sophisticated, all competing for dominance in a world where authority came from the barrel of a gun and the loyalty of armed followers. Raiders emerged from the chaos like predators sensing wounded prey, their bands roaming the wastes in search of the weak and unprepared, taking what they needed and destroying what they could not carry, living lives of violent immediacy that asked no questions about tomorrow. Yet even among these chaotic elements, patterns began to emerge, hierarchies established themselves, and the seeds of something more organized than simple banditry took root in the irradiated soil. The strip itself, that glittering jewel of pre-war excess that had once drawn millions to its promises of fortune and escape, stood silent and dark for decades after the bombs fell. its casinos gutted by fire and time, its famous signs dark for want of power that no longer flowed through dead electrical grids. The great hotels that had housed thousands of guests in air-conditioned luxury became shelters for mutated creatures and desperate survivors, their lobbies filled with sand and debris, their slot machines rusted into eternal silence. Yet even in this state of abandonment, the Strip retained a certain terrible beauty, its architecture speaking of a confidence and vision that the post-war world struggled to comprehend, let alone recreate. The surrounding territories fell under the control of various groups whose power was measured not in wealth or legal authority, but in armed strength and the willingness to use violence to defend claimed territories. To the west, the new California Republic expanded gradually eastward, bringing with them concepts of law, taxation, and bureaucracy that seemed almost quaintly civilized in a world where might generally made right. To the east, the Legion of Caesar gathered strength, forging tribes into a military machine through brutal discipline and the complete subordination of individual will to collective purpose. And in the spaces between these growing powers, smaller groups fought for survival and dominance, their conflicts shaping the political landscape as surely as wind and water shaped the physical desert. This was the world into which tribes were born, not from deliberate planning or careful social engineering, but from the simple necessity of banding together for mutual protection in an environment that killed the solitary with pitiless efficiency. These were not the romanticized tribes of pre-war anthropology, but desperate collections of survivors who had learned that cooperation, however grudging, offered better odds than isolation. They formed around charismatic leaders, shared resources, or simple proximity, their cultures developing organically from the materials and memories available to their founders. The tribal societies that emerged in the Mojave developed their own hierarchies, rituals, and codes of behavior, some drawing on fragments of pre-war culture they half remembered or half understood, others creating entirely new traditions from the circumstances of their existence. Leadership in these groups was rarely hereditary in any formal sense, but rather accrued to those who demonstrated strength, cunning, or the ability to provide for the group's needs, whether through successful raiding, knowledge of water sources, or skill in combat. The strong ruled until they were displaced by the stronger, and loyalty was a commodity that could be bought, sold, or seized through demonstrations of power. Among these various tribal groups, the boot riders established themselves in territories close enough to the Strip to see its dark towers on the horizon, a constant reminder of the old world's grandeur and their own comparative poverty. They were raiders and scavengers primarily, taking what they needed from the weak and unwary, fighting off rivals who sought to claim their territory or resources, living lives that were brutal, short, and filled with the kind of violence that becomes routine when survival depends on the systematic exploitation of others. Their camp was a collection of makeshift shelters, constructed from scavenged materials, offering protection from the elements and concealment from enemies, but nothing that could be called comfort by any civilized standard. The boot riders, like most tribal groups, developed their own culture from the fragments of pre-war America they encountered in their scavenging, mixing these artifacts with their own invented traditions to create something uniquely wasteland in character. They valued strength and courage in combat, as all raider groups did, but they also developed a certain crude pride in their identity, marking themselves with particular styles of dress and decoration that announced their affiliation to friend and enemy alike. Boots, naturally, featured prominently in their aesthetic, whether scavenged from pre-war stores or stripped from the feet of defeated enemies, worn as symbols of status and practical necessities for traversing the harsh desert terrain. Within the tribe's hierarchy, positions were earned through demonstrations of capability in the skills the group valued most: fighting, raiding, tracking, and the ability to survive in conditions that would kill softer individuals. Young men grew up understanding that their worth would be measured in violence successfully applied, in resources secured for the tribe, in enemies defeated and territory defended. It was a world that rewarded physical prowess and immediate practical intelligence, while offering little value to qualities like compassion, education, or the kind of long-term strategic thinking that characterized more stable societies. Women in the tribe occupied positions determined by the same brutal logic that governed all tribal politics, their status dependent on their relationships with powerful men, their own capabilities in areas the tribe valued, or their success in carving out niches where they could exercise influence despite the male-dominated hierarchy. Children learned early that the world was dangerous and unforgiving, that survival required constant vigilance, and that sentiment was a luxury that could get you killed if you allowed it to interfere with necessary violence. This was the crucible in which tribal youth were forged, emerging as hard, practical individuals, shaped entirely by the demands of wasteland existence. Yet even in this harsh environment, variations in personality and capability emerged, as they always do in human societies regardless of the constraints imposed by circumstance. Some tribal members embraced the raider lifestyle with enthusiasm, finding in sanctioned violence an outlet for impulses that peacetime society would have suppressed. Others participated in tribal activities out of necessity rather than conviction, maintaining internal reservations about the violence they witnessed and perpetrated. And a very few, looked at the world beyond their tribe's immediate concerns and wondered if life might offer possibilities beyond endless cycles of raiding and survival. The values that shaped young men in tribes like the Boot Riders were straightforward and unambiguous compared to the complex moral codes of civilized society. Strength was admirable, weakness contemptible, loyalty to the tribe was essential, disloyalty punishable by death. Taking from outsiders was not theft but survival, killing them not murder but necessity. These values created individuals capable of functioning effectively in the wasteland's harsh realities, while simultaneously limiting their capacity to imagine or create anything beyond the brutal present. It was a system that perpetuated itself through cultural transmission, each generation teaching the next that this was simply how the world worked, that alternatives were fantasies indulged by the weak and doomed. But the Mojave, for all its harshness, retained echoes of what had come before, fragments of the old world scattered across its landscape, like seeds, waiting for the right conditions to germinate. The ruins themselves spoke of a civilization that had mastered technologies the tribes could barely comprehend, that had created wonders of engineering and architecture, that had lived with a degree of comfort and security that seemed almost mythological to those struggling for daily survival. Scavenging parties would occasionally stumble upon caches of pre-war goods that revealed glimpses of this lost world. Magazines showing impossibly clean people in elaborate clothes. Advertisements promising products that solved problems the tribes had never considered problems. Books and holotapes containing information about sciences and arts that had no obvious application to wasteland survival. For most tribal members, these artifacts were valuable only for their immediate practical utility or their trade value with merchants who occasionally ventured into tribal territories. A pre-war book might be burned for warmth without a second thought about the knowledge it contained. A faded advertisement might be torn up for use as kindling without consideration of the world it represented. The tribes existed in an eternal present tense, focused on immediate survival to the exclusion of past or future, historical memory, or long-term planning. They were creatures of the moment, responding to immediate threats and opportunities with the reactive intelligence that evolution had provided for survival in dangerous environments. But the old-world glamour, visible in even the most degraded ruins, held a different kind of power for those rare individuals whose minds worked differently, who possessed the capacity to imagine themselves existing in contexts beyond their immediate circumstances. The faded elegance of a pre-war poster, showing a man in an immaculate suit, could plant ideas in certain minds, suggestions that identity was mutable, that one could be something other than what circumstances of birth had determined. A holotape playing scratchy recordings of pre-war music, its singers performing with confidence and style for audiences long dead, could inspire yearnings for a kind of sophistication that tribal life made impossible. These fragments of pre-war culture created a mythology of the old world as a place of abundance, beauty, and possibility, a golden age before the fall, when humans had lived like gods compared to the degraded existence of wasteland survivors. This mythology was simultaneously accurate and deeply misleading, capturing the genuine achievements of pre-war civilization while eliding the moral failures and systematic injustices that had led to nuclear annihilation. But for those who encountered these artifacts with minds capable of imagination, the mythology was intoxicating, offering visions of alternative ways of being that made tribal existence seem not inevitable but chosen, not the only possibility, but merely one option among many. The psychological landscape of wanting to transcend one's origins while being trapped within them created a particular kind of suffering that most tribal members never experienced because they never conceived of alternatives to their circumstances. To see the checkered floor of a ruined casino and imagine yourself walking across it in polished shoes rather than worn boots, to encounter a mannequin in a decaying store window wearing a suit and picture yourself in such clothing, to find a holotape of someone speaking with educated diction and wonder what it would feel like to shape words with such precision. These experiences created a hunger that tribal life could never satisfy. It was the suffering of expanded consciousness, trapped in limiting circumstances, of possibilities glimpsed but apparently unattainable. For those afflicted with this particular form of discontent, every day of tribal existence became a reminder of the gap between what was and what might be, between the crude realities of raider life and the refined elegance suggested by pre-war remnants. The violent masculinity that tribal culture demanded began to seem not natural but performed, not essential but contingent. The limited vocabulary and rough speech patterns of tribal communication started to sound not like the only way to talk, but like a dialect that marked its speakers as inferior to those who had once inhabited the ruined world. The whole structure of tribal existence, its values and assumptions and daily practices, began to appear what they had always been. The psychological barriers to such transformation were immense, rooted in tribal culture's emphasis on continuity and tradition, in the conservative impulse that made dramatic change feel like a kind of death. The Securitron demonstration that accompanied House's offer removed any doubt about his capacity to enforce compliance, as the robots displayed military capabilities that made tribal resistance obviously futile. Machine guns, missile launchers, and grenade volleys, delivered with mechanical precision, demonstrated that House possessed the power to exterminate the tribes entirely if he chose, that his offer of partnership was an act of mercy rather than weakness. The tribal leaders who witnessed this display understood immediately that they faced an existential choice, that their traditional way of life was ending, regardless of their preferences, that the only question was whether they would adapt or be destroyed. For Benny, House's offer represented the answer to prayers he had not quite known how to articulate, the opportunity for transformation that he had yearned for without seeing any plausible path to achievement. Here was a chance not merely to escape tribal life, but to be actively assisted in becoming something else, to receive training and resources and legitimacy in exchange for his willingness to abandon the boot rider's crude culture and embrace the sophisticated persona that House's vision demanded. The immediate enthusiasm with which Benny embraced this offer stood in sharp contrast to the hesitation and resistance displayed by most of his tribal companions, his reaction revealing how thoroughly he had already separated himself psychologically from tribal identity. The seduction of civilization that House offered extended beyond mere material comfort to encompass psychological and cultural dimensions that Benny found irresistible in their appeal. The promise of wealth meant not just caps and trade goods, but actual pre-war currency, chips that could be exchanged for luxuries rather than mere necessities, the possibility of living with abundance rather than scarcity. The promise of power meant not the crude dominance of tribal hierarchy, but legitimate authority within a functioning social structure, the ability to command through position rather than constant physical threat. Most intoxicating of all was the promise of transformation itself, the explicit permission to become someone new, to shed tribal identity like a snake shedding dead skin and emerge as something polished and refined. The Tops Casino, which House designated as the boot rider's future domain, stood as a monument to the kind of existence Benny had only glimpsed in fragments and fantasies. Its Art Deco elegance, speaking of a world where aesthetic considerations mattered as much as practical ones. The building itself required extensive restoration after decades of neglect, but its bones were sound, its architecture still capable of evoking the glamour and sophistication of pre-war Vegas once the accumulated debris and damage were cleared away. House's offer included not just the building but the training necessary to operate it properly, instruction in everything from casino management to customer service, to the maintenance of the complex equipment that made modern gambling establishments function. The training that House provided to transform tribal raiders into civilized casino operators was comprehensive and demanding, requiring the unlearning of deeply ingrained habits and the acquisition of entirely new modes of behavior and thought. Benny and his fellow boot riders were taught to speak properly, to moderate their vocabularies and eliminate the crude slang that marked them as wasteland savages, to adopt the kind of measured, professional communication that customers expected from legitimate businesses. They learned to wear suits with comfort and confidence, to move with the kind of controlled grace that signaled authority rather than threat, to present themselves as sophisticated operators rather than barely reformed raiders. The psychological transformation required by this training was even more profound than the superficial changes in dress and speech, demanding that the former raiders reimagine their entire relationship to violence, property, and social interaction. As tribal members, they had taken what they wanted through force and felt no compunction about violence against outsiders. As casino operators, they would need to protect customer property, maintain order without excessive brutality, and understand that their wealth would come from voluntary exchange rather than coercive extraction. This shift from predator to service provider required rewiring neural pathways established through years of raider conditioning, creating new responses to situations that had previously triggered violence. Learning to manage a business rather than simply raiding for resources introduced the boot riders to concepts of long-term planning, sustainable operations, and customer relations that had no equivalent in tribal experience. A casino's success depended on customers returning willingly, on maintaining reputation for fair dealing, on balancing the house edge that ensured profit against the customer experience that ensured continued patronage. These calculations were far more complex than the simple arithmetic of tribal raiding, where success was measured purely in resources extracted and enemies defeated. Benny demonstrated particular aptitude for understanding these business concepts, his intelligence finding full expression in challenges that rewarded strategic thinking rather than just physical prowess. The enthusiasm with which Benny embraced every aspect of House's transformation program distinguished him from most of his fellow boot riders, who participated with varying degrees of reluctance and resistance. Where others grumbled about the restrictions House imposed, Benny saw liberation from tribal constraints. Where others felt uncomfortable in suits and formal speech, Benny felt like he was finally inhabiting his true identity. Where others viewed the training as imposition to be endured, Benny approached it as opportunity to be maximized, absorbing every lesson with the intensity of someone who had been starving for exactly this kind of knowledge and validation. But the tribal leader who had commanded the boot riders through years of successful raiding and territorial defense viewed House's offer with deep suspicion and fundamental hostility, seeing in it not opportunity but existential threat to everything he valued and understood. This man had built his identity and authority entirely within the framework of tribal culture, His power derived from physical dominance and successful violence rather than the kind of legitimate organizational authority that House's system would provide. The transformation that House demanded would eliminate the very qualities that made him valuable to his people, replacing them with skills he had no confidence he could master and no interest in learning. The tribal chief's resistance to House's vision was not merely personal preference, but reflected a coherent understanding of what transformation would cost the tribe in terms of identity and autonomy. Accepting House's offer meant placing themselves under his authority, following his rules, becoming employees rather than independent raiders. It meant abandoning the freedom to take what they wanted in favor of earning through service. It meant submitting to oversight and discipline from someone outside the tribe, accountable to standards they had no role in creating. For a man whose entire life had been defined by autonomy and dominance, these costs seemed to outweigh any material benefits House might provide. The growing conflict between the tribal leader's resistance and Benny's enthusiasm created a crisis point that would force resolution one way or another, as the bootriders could not simultaneously accept and reject House's offer. The tribe would either transform as a unit under new leadership that embraced the opportunity, or it would refuse and face the consequences of defying House's ultimatum. There was no middle ground, no compromise that would preserve tribal autonomy while also securing the benefits of cooperation. The situation demanded a choice, and that choice would determine not just the tribe's future, but the fates of everyone within it. Benny's calculation regarding this crisis was cold and pragmatic, informed by years of observation about how power functioned and what actions circumstances demanded. The tribal leader's refusal to accept House's offer was not just an obstacle to Benny's personal transformation, but a threat to the entire tribe's survival, as House would certainly eliminate them if they refused to cooperate. From Benny's perspective, the chief's resistance was not principled leadership, but stubborn blindness, an inability to recognize when circumstances had fundamentally changed and old ways were no longer viable. The tribe needed new leadership that understood the strategic situation and was willing to make necessary adaptations, even if those adaptations felt like betrayal of traditional values. The decision to kill the tribal chief was not made impulsively or emotionally, but through careful deliberation about costs, benefits, and alternatives. Benny's mind working through the problem with the same strategic intelligence he would later apply to far grander schemes. He assessed the chief's support among other tribal members, identifying those who shared the leader's resistance and those who might be persuaded to accept change under different leadership. He considered the timing, choosing a moment when the chief's position was vulnerable and when action could be presented as necessary intervention rather than personal ambition. He planned the execution itself with attention to details that would minimize resistance and maximize acceptance of the fait accompli. The murder, when Benny finally committed it, was accomplished with efficiency that reflected both his practical capabilities and his emotional detachment from the act's moral implications. The specifics of how the chief died, whether through poison or blade or bullet in darkness, mattered less than the fact that Benny personally ensured the death and personally claimed responsibility afterward, establishing through this action that he possessed both the ruthlessness to kill a leader and the authority to replace him. The killing was simultaneously an ending and a beginning, the final act of Benny's existence as a conventional tribal member and the first act of his new identity as someone willing to sacrifice anything, including loyalty and traditional values, in pursuit of transformation and power. The justification that Benny offered himself for this act of ultimate betrayal was framed in terms of collective benefit rather than personal ambition, a rationalization that allowed him to avoid confronting the full moral weight of killing the man who had led and protected him. The chief's death was necessary to save the tribe from destruction, he told himself. House would have eliminated them all if they refused his offer, so removing the obstacle to acceptance was actually an act of salvation rather than murder. The tribe would prosper under the new arrangement in ways impossible under traditional raider existence, so the chief's death enabled collective advancement rather than merely personal gain. These narratives, whether believed sincerely or adopted cynically, a mental and cultural environment offered nothing to satisfy the appetites that exposure to pre-war artifacts had awakened. He wanted not just to survive, but to live with style, not just to communicate, but to speak with eloquence, not just to exist, but to craft an identity that reflected conscious choices rather than accidents of birth. The tensions between conformity and aspiration manifested in Benny's relationships with other tribe members, creating a distance that others sensed but could not quite articulate. He was competent in the skills the tribe valued, capable with weapons and reliable in combat situations, contributing adequately to raiding operations and pulling his weight in tribal activities. But there was something withheld in his participation, a sense that he was performing roles rather than inhabiting them fully, going through motions that he had mastered but did not genuinely embrace. This quality made him respected for his capabilities, but not quite trusted in the way that wholehearted tribal members were trusted, creating an isolation that Benny felt acutely but accepted as the price of maintaining his private vision. The tribal rituals that marked significant events in boot rider culture, from coming-of-age ceremonies to pre-raid preparations to celebrations of successful violence, held meaning for most members as genuine expressions of shared identity and collective purpose. For Benny, these same rituals became performances he executed with technical proficiency while maintaining internal distance, understanding their social function but unable to invest them with sincere belief or emotional commitment. He said the words, made the gestures, participated in the violence that tribal bonding required, but a part of his consciousness remained separate, observing and analyzing rather than simply being present in the experience. This divided consciousness, necessary for preserving his sense of potential transcendence, also created a profound loneliness that no tribal relationship could alleviate. The vision of something beyond tribal existence that Benny nurtured through years of private cultivation was initially vague and unrealistic, more fantasy than plan, built from fragments of pre-war culture that he had encountered without fully understanding. He imagined himself somehow transported to the old world, walking through intact casinos in a fine suit, speaking to educated people who would recognize him as one of their own, living in comfort and security rather than constant struggle and violence. These fantasies provided psychological escape from the constraints of his actual existence, while also serving a more practical function, keeping alive the possibility of transformation that prevented complete resignation to tribal life as his permanent condition. But as Benny matured and his understanding of the wasteland's actual political and economic structures deepened through observation and occasional contact with traders and travelers, his vision began to evolve from pure fantasy towards something approaching a realistic goal. He learned that the new California Republic to the west had recreated some approximation of pre-war civilization with cities, laws, and social structures that went beyond tribal organization. He heard stories of Mr. House in New Vegas, a figure from before the war who had somehow survived and maintained control over the Strip through technological means. He began to understand that transformation was not just a private dream but a possibility that others had achieved, that the categories separating tribal raider from civilized person were not absolute but permeable to those willing and able to cross them. The limitations of tribal life became increasingly apparent to Benny as his horizons expanded through learning and observation, the gap between what the tribe offered and what he desired growing wider with each passing year. The tribal economy was purely extractive, based on taking from others rather than creating value, offering no path to the kind of wealth that might enable genuine independence. The tribal culture was intellectually barren, its oral traditions limited to practical knowledge and crude entertainment, providing no stimulation for minds capable of appreciating complexity. The tribal social structure was rigid within its narrow confines, offering advancement only through violence or age, with no recognition of the kinds of talents that Benny had cultivated through his private education. Most troubling was the recognition that tribal life, for all its brutality and hardship, was also deeply conservative, actively hostile to change or deviation from established patterns. The very qualities that made Benny different, his education and refinement and vision of alternatives, were precisely the things that tribal culture would suppress or punish if they became too visible. He could not reform the tribe from within because the tribe had no interest in reform, no conception that their way of life might be improved or transcended. The choice facing him was becoming increasingly clear: either abandon his aspirations and sink fully into tribal existence, or find a way to leave the tribe entirely and seek his fortune in the wider wasteland. The restlessness that characterized Benny's final years as a boot rider was visible to others in the tribe, even if they could not understand its source, manifesting in increased risk-taking during raids, in longer absences on scavenging expeditions, in the barely concealed contempt with which he sometimes regarded tribal rituals and celebrations. His position in the tribal hierarchy was secure enough that these deviations did not immediately threaten his status, but they created an atmosphere of anticipation, a sense that something was building toward a resolution that would fundamentally alter his relationship with the tribe. He was like a spring being compressed, storing energy that would eventually have to be released in action of some kind. The sense that change was coming permeated Benny's consciousness during this period, not based on any specific knowledge of future events, but arising from the simple unsustainability of his current situation. He could not continue indefinitely to live a double life, performing tribal identity while privately cultivating aspirations that contradicted everything the tribe represented. At some point, a choice would have to be made, an action taken that would commit him irrevocably to one path or another. The question was not whether change would come, but what form it would take, whether it would be something he initiated and controlled or something imposed on him by circumstances beyond his influence. The Mojave itself seemed poised on the edge of transformation during these years, the various factions that would later contest for control of the region gradually gathering strength and extending their influence. The NCR's expansion eastward brought their patrols closer to tribal territories, creating both threats and opportunities for groups like the Boot Riders. Caesar's legion was beginning its conquest of tribes across the Colorado, its brutal efficiency transforming the political landscape through systematic violence and forced assimilation. And Mr. House, though few in the tribes knew it, was preparing to emerge from his long isolation and reclaim control of New Vegas, a plan that would require the cooperation or elimination of the tribal groups that had claimed the Strip's ruins as their territory. Benny's consciousness of these larger forces was limited but growing, his intelligence network consisting mainly of observations during raids and conversations with the occasional trader or traveler who ventured into tribal lands. He understood that the wasteland was not static, that power was shifting, that opportunities might emerge for those positioned to exploit them. But he did not yet know what specific form these opportunities might take, what catalyst might transform his private aspirations into achievable goals. He could only wait, prepare himself as best he could through continued self-education and cultivation of useful skills, and trust that when the moment came, he would recognize it and have the courage to seize it. The tribal camp continued its daily routines during this period of waiting, its inhabitants going about their business of raiding and surviving, without awareness that their entire way of life was about to be offered a stark choice between transformation and extinction. The Boot Riders' territory remained under their control, their position in the wasteland's complex ecology of violence and resource competition stable enough that they had no reason to anticipate dramatic change. Their leader maintained authority through the same methods that had always worked, unaware that one of his subordinates was cultivating ambitions and capabilities that would soon make tribal leadership seem like a trivial achievement compared to possibilities opening in the wider Mojave. And Benny himself, for all his restlessness and yearning for transformation, could not have predicted the specific form that change would take when it finally arrived, could not have imagined that salvation would come not from his own efforts to escape tribal life, but from an offer made by a man who had been alive before the bombs fell, who would see in the tribal raiders not savages to be eliminated, but raw material to be refined into something useful for his grand vision. The stage was set for the most dramatic transformation of Benny's life, the moment when the gap between what he was and what he dreamed of becoming would suddenly, violently close, when the boot rider would die and the chairman would be born through an act of betrayal that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The return of Mr. House to active control of New Vegas represented one of those pivotal moments in wasteland history when the actions of a single individual reshape the political landscape for entire regions, forcing all surrounding actors to recalibrate their strategies and expectations in response to the sudden emergence of a power they had not anticipated. For 2 centuries, House had slumbered in his medical pod beneath the Lucky 38 casino, his brilliant mind suspended in technological stasis, while his autonomous systems defended the Strip from the worst effects of nuclear devastation, waiting for the moment when conditions would permit his return to consciousness and the resumption of his grand vision for the jewel of the Mojave. That awakening, when it finally came, was not a gradual process, but a decisive emergence from hibernation, driven by House's calculation that sufficient time had passed for the wasteland to stabilize into patterns he could manipulate and control. His Securitron army, those peculiar robots with their menacing faces displayed on monitor screens and their considerable military capabilities, had defended the Strip throughout his slumber, preventing its complete destruction, while allowing enough decay to ensure that no rival power could establish permanent control before House himself was ready to assert dominance. Now, with his consciousness fully restored and his assessment of the strategic situation complete, House prepared to transform Las Vegas from a collection of ruins into New Vegas, a functioning city-state under his absolute control. The vision that House brought to this project was uniquely informed by his pre-war experience as a visionary entrepreneur and technological genius. His understanding of how civilization functioned when it actually functioned, rather than the degraded approximations that characterized most post-war attempts at social organization. He did not seek merely to survive or to accumulate power for its own sake, as so many wasteland leaders did, but rather to recreate something approximating the glory of pre-war Vegas, to build a monument to human achievement that would stand as proof that the species retained the capacity for greatness even after nearly destroying itself. This vision required not just technology and resources, but also human actors capable of managing the complex operations that a functioning casino city demanded. The Securitron army provided House with overwhelming military advantage in the immediate vicinity of the Strip, their advanced weaponry and programming making them superior to any force the surrounding tribes could muster. But House understood that robots alone could not create the kind of vibrant, functional city he envisioned. That human presence was essential, both for operating the casinos and for creating the atmosphere of excitement and possibility that had made pre-war Vegas a destination rather than just a location. He needed people, specifically people who could be trained to perform sophisticated roles in his carefully orchestrated resurrection of old-world glamour, people who were currently raiders and tribals but who might, with proper motivation and instruction, be transformed into something resembling civilized employees. The offer that House extended to the 3 major tribal groups occupying the Strip's ruins was simultaneously generous and non-negotiable, framed as an opportunity rather than an ultimatum, but backed by the implicit threat of Securitron violence against any who refused. The tribes could transform themselves into proper casino operators, adopting new identities and learning new skills in exchange for wealth, security, and legitimate positions in House's new order. Or they could refuse, in which case they would be eliminated or driven from the Strip to make room for others more willing to accept House's vision. The choice was structured to appear free, while actually being constrained by the overwhelming disparity in military power between House's robots and tribal weapons. For most tribal members, this offer was incomprehensible or terrifying, representing a demand that they abandon everything that defined their identity in exchange for promises of a future they could barely imagine. The tribal way of life, for all its brutality and hardship, at least had the virtue of familiarity, of being a known quantity in an uncertain world. House's vision of transformation required a leap of faith that most raiders were psychologically incapable of making, a willingness to believe that they could become something categorically different from what individuals, and he coordinated with House's security systems to ensure that Legion operatives were monitored and, when necessary, quietly eliminated or expelled. These counterintelligence activities provided Benny with insights into how the Legion operated and what threats they might eventually pose to New Vegas, knowledge that would prove valuable in his later schemes. The persona of competence and cool that Benny projected to the world was not merely superficial performance, but was grounded in genuine capability, developed through years of dedicated effort and practical experience. He was competent at managing complex operations, cool under pressure when problems arose, effective at solving the varied challenges that casino management presented. This authentic skill base made his performance convincing in ways that pure fakery never could, allowing him to inspire confidence in employees and customers alike, because they could see that his projected image was backed by actual ability. How the role shaped the man during these years of service to House was profound and multifaceted. The daily practice of acting as a sophisticated casino operator, gradually transforming performance into reality, until Benny himself sometimes forgot where the act ended and authentic identity began. The checkered suit that had once felt like a costume became his natural covering. The refined speech that had required conscious effort became his automatic mode of expression. The strategic thinking that had been cultivated with difficulty became his instinctive approach to problems. He had become what he had pretended to be. The transformation he had sought achieved through sustained effort and the opportunities that House's system provided. Swank emerged during this period as Benny's most trusted lieutenant within the chairman's hierarchy. His role as floor manager, placing him in position to observe all aspects of casino operations, while executing Benny's directives with reliability and discretion. The relationship between Benny and Swank developed through years of working together on the challenges of managing the tops, building a foundation of mutual respect and shared experience that went deeper than mere convenience or calculated alliance. Swank had been a boot rider like Benny, had experienced the same transformation from tribal raider to civilized operator, and this common background created bonds of understanding that outsiders could never fully share. The loyalty that Swank demonstrated toward Benny was rooted partly in genuine affection and admiration, seeing in his leader someone who had successfully navigated the transformation that they had all undergone, who had proven that tribal origins need not determine ultimate destiny. But Swank's loyalty was also pragmatic, based on recognition that his own position and prosperity depended on Benny's continued success and favor, that opposing or betraying someone who had proven both competent and ruthless would be dangerous and counterproductive. This combination of emotional attachment and practical calculation created a relationship that was as stable as any could be in the morally ambiguous environment of New Vegas. Tommy and the other chairman enforcers who formed Benny's inner circle served functions that were more narrowly focused than Swank's managerial role, but equally essential to maintaining control over the tops and managing threats that required more direct intervention than verbal persuasion could provide. These were men who had excelled in the violent aspects of tribal life and had retained those capabilities even as they adopted civilized veneers, able to break bones or end lives when Benny's interests demanded such services, while maintaining enough discipline to avoid the kind of excessive brutality that would damage the casino's reputation or draw unwanted attention from House's oversight. Building a network of loyalty among these key subordinates required Benny to employ the same mix of charisma, manipulation, and genuine care for their welfare that characterized all his successful relationships, creating bonds strong enough to ensure cooperation and discretion, while remaining alert to the possibility that loyalty might shift if circumstances changed sufficiently. He rewarded competence with increased responsibility and material benefits, punished betrayal or incompetence with demotion or expulsion, and maintained constant awareness of who among his people might pose threats and who could be relied upon absolutely. These networks were not just operational necessities, but insurance policies against future contingencies, relationships that could be activated when schemes required trusted accomplices. The careful balance between friendship and manipulation that characterized Benny's relationships with his inner circle reflected his fundamental understanding that genuine human connection and calculated exploitation were not mutually exclusive, but could coexist within the same relationship, each person serving the other's interests, while also maintaining private agendas and reservations. Benny genuinely liked Swank and enjoyed his company, valued his competence, and appreciated his loyalty, but he also recognized that Swank was ultimately a tool to be used in pursuit of larger goals, someone whose welfare mattered primarily as it served Benny's interests. This ability to simultaneously care for people and view them instrumentally was among Benny's most valuable and most troubling characteristics. Seeds of future plans were planted during these years of apparent loyal service to House, not as fully formed schemes, but as observations and possibilities that accumulated in Benny's mind, like components waiting for the moment when they could be assembled into actionable strategies. He noticed the extent of House's dependence on certain key technologies, the vulnerabilities that existed within seemingly impregnable systems, the gaps between House's knowledge and the actual conditions on the Strip. He observed the tensions between different factions and interest groups, the resentments that NCR expansion created, the opportunities that might emerge if the current balance of power shifted. He thought about what it would take to replace House, rather than merely serve him, what resources and capabilities would be required to seize independent control. The growing discontent that gradually consumed Benny's satisfaction with his position under House emerged not from any single grievance or sudden revelation, but from the accumulation of small resentments and frustrated ambitions that successful service paradoxically intensified rather than satisfied. Each demonstration of his competence reminded him that he was capable of far more than his subordinate position allowed, that the skills and intelligence he had developed were being deployed in service of someone else's vision rather than his own. Each interaction with House reinforced his awareness that he remained fundamentally an employee, subject to oversight and control, his authority derivative rather than absolute. Success, bringing new ambitions, was a pattern as old as human civilization, the satisfaction of achieved goals, creating appetite for greater accomplishments rather than contentment with current status. And Benny was thoroughly susceptible to this psychological dynamic. He had transformed himself from tribal raider to sophisticated casino operator, achieving something remarkable by wasteland standards. But this very achievement raised questions about what further transformations might be possible. If he could successfully navigate one seemingly impossible transition, might he not accomplish others equally dramatic? If he could manage a casino effectively under House's oversight, might he not run all of New Vegas if given the opportunity? Chafing under House's control manifested in subtle ways that Benny was careful to conceal from the oversight systems he knew monitored his activities. Small acts of private rebellion that provided psychological release without triggering consequences. He would delay implementing House's directives by hours or days when immediate compliance was not strictly necessary, asserting minimal autonomy through these tiny resistances. He cultivated relationships and information sources that House did not know about, creating knowledge advantages that might prove valuable in future contingencies. He thought frequently about the restrictions House imposed and imagined scenarios in which those restrictions no longer applied. The realization that House would never truly share power was not a sudden epiphany, but a gradually solidifying certainty built from years of observation and interaction. The understanding that House's entire system was designed to prevent exactly the kind of elevation that Benny increasingly desired. House did not want partners or equals, but competent subordinates who would execute his vision without developing visions of their own. The families would always be employees, however wealthy and well treated, because House's entire conception of proper order placed him at the apex of a hierarchy that allowed no genuine power sharing. This was not cruelty or paranoia on House's part, but simply the logical structure of autocratic rule, which by definition could not accommodate competing centers of authority. Benny's vision of independence taking shape during these years of service was initially vague and unrealistic, more frustrated fantasy than practical plan, built from resentment rather than careful strategic analysis. He imagined himself somehow displaced House and claiming New Vegas for himself, operating the Strip according to his own preferences rather than House's directives, answering to no one and constrained only by circumstances rather than imposed authority. These imaginings provided psychological escape from the frustrations of subordinate status, while also serving the practical function of keeping alive the possibility of transformation, preventing resignation to permanent employment as his ultimate destiny. The dangerous thought that crystallized with increasing clarity as Benny's discontent grew was simple in its formulation, but staggering in its implications. What if House could be removed from power? And what if Benny himself could be the one to accomplish this removal and claim the resulting vacuum? The question was not whether House should be removed, as Benny's answer to that was increasingly clear in his own mind, but whether removal was actually possible and what resources and strategies would be required to accomplish it. House seemed nearly invulnerable, protected by technology and systems that anticipated and prevented conventional threats. But invulnerability was often illusion, and even the most sophisticated defenses had weaknesses for those clever and determined enough to find them. The discovery of the platinum chip's existence came to Benny not through deliberate investigation or systematic intelligence gathering, but through one of those fortunate accidents that occasionally reward the observant and curious. A casual conversation overheard between House and one of his Securitrons about preparations for receiving a delivery of extraordinary importance. The mention of a platinum chip, spoken with an emphasis that suggested significance far beyond mere monetary value, caught Benny's attention in a way that more obvious secrets might not have, precisely because House's tone conveyed both anticipation and concern, emotions that the usually controlled autocrat rarely displayed even to his mechanical servants. The initial fragment of information was tantalizingly incomplete, providing just enough detail to suggest enormous importance while leaving crucial questions unanswered, and Benny found himself unable to dismiss the matter from his thoughts, despite having no immediate way to learn more. He began paying closer attention to House's communications and activities, watching for additional mentions of this mysterious chip, gradually piecing together a picture of something that House considered essential to his long-term plans for New Vegas. The chip was being delivered from somewhere outside the Mojave, carried by a courier whose identity House knew but Benny did not, expected to arrive within a time frame that House tracked with unusual precision. Understanding the chip's significance to House's plans required Benny to engage in research that pushed the boundaries of permissible curiosity, accessing technical documentation and strategic planning files that were not explicitly forbidden to him, but which House clearly preferred to keep compartmentalized and restricted. What Benny discovered through this careful investigation exceeded even his most optimistic assumptions about the chip's importance, revealing that this seemingly small object represented the key to upgrading the Securitron, allowed Benny to live with his choice without crippling guilt. But crossing the line from which there could be no return marked Benny permanently, establishing a pattern that would characterize all his future actions and defining him as someone for whom loyalty, tradition, and moral constraint would never outweigh strategic advantage and personal ambition. The willingness to kill a leader and kinsman demonstrated that Benny operated according to a moral calculus fundamentally different from most people, one in which outcomes justified means and personal advancement justified betrayal. This did not make him uniquely evil by wasteland standards, where violence and betrayal were commonplace, but it revealed a capacity for cold, strategic violence that went beyond mere survival and entered the realm of calculated power-seeking. The transformation of the boot riders into the chairmen proceeded rapidly once the obstacle of resistant leadership was removed. The tribe embracing House's offer with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but unanimous recognition that refusal was no longer a viable option. New names were adopted to mark the break from tribal identity, members shedding their raider monikers in favor of designations that sounded more civilized and professional. New identities were constructed from whole cloth, the chairmen creating origin stories and personas that minimized their raider past and emphasized their new roles as legitimate businessmen. New roles within the casino's hierarchy were assigned based on demonstrated competence and willingness to embrace transformation, creating a structure that rewarded adaptation over traditional tribal status. Benny's position in this new hierarchy was secured not just by his role in eliminating the old chief, but by his obvious enthusiasm for and competence in performing the sophisticated tasks that casino operation demanded. He had prepared for this transformation through years of private study, and now that preparation paid dividends as he demonstrated capabilities that his fellow chairmen struggled to match. His speech was already more refined than theirs, his understanding of pre-war culture more comprehensive, his comfort with the trappings of civilization more genuine. These advantages, combined with his demonstrated ruthlessness and strategic thinking, positioned him as the natural leader of the transformed tribe. The initial success of the chairman's transformation exceeded even House's expectations. As the former raiders proved capable of learning the complex skills required to operate a functioning casino when properly motivated and trained, the Tops reopened its doors to customers with surprising smoothness, its games running honestly enough to satisfy House's standards, its staff professional enough to create the atmosphere of legitimate entertainment rather than dangerous exploitation. Customers from the NCR and independent travelers began to visit regularly, their caps flowing into the chairman's coffers and validating House's vision of New Vegas as a destination that could attract voluntary patronage rather than requiring coercive extraction. The validation that this success provided was immensely powerful for Benny personally, confirming that his years of yearning for transformation had been based on genuine potential rather than mere fantasy. He could function in civilized society, could manage complex operations, could interact with educated customers without revealing his origins. The suit felt natural on his body, the sophisticated speech comfortable in his mouth, the role of casino operator authentic rather than performed. Everything he had hoped about his capacity for transcendence proved accurate. The gap between tribal raider and civilized businessman bridged through will and opportunity in ways that seemed almost miraculous after years of doubt and frustration. But the cost of this transformation, measured in betrayed loyalty and murdered leadership, remained embedded in Benny's psyche, even as he celebrated the material and social success that followed from his actions. The chief's death had been necessary, he insisted to himself, but necessity did not erase the fact of what he had done or eliminate the psychological consequences of having killed the man who had led him. The boot-rider identity had been shed, but shedding identity left marks that could not simply be covered by a fine suit and polished speech. The person Benny had become through transformation was inseparable from the person he had been before, the sophisticated chairman containing within himself the calculating raider who had murdered his way to opportunity. And most significantly, the pattern established through this first great betrayal would repeat itself in Benny's future dealings, the lesson learned being that loyalty was negotiable and authority was something to be seized rather than earned through service. If killing a tribal chief to secure transformation was justified by the benefits that followed, then killing or betraying anyone else who stood between Benny and his ambitions could be justified through similar logic. The moral constraints that might have limited his actions had been decisively broken through the act of murdering his leader, and once broken, they could not simply be restored when convenient. The man in the checkered suit who charmed customers at the Tops was the same man who had shed blood to get there, and that duality would define everything he would become. Working under Mr. House's strict and exacting rules provided Benny with an education in power and control that far exceeded anything tribal life could have offered, revealing how authority could be exercised through systems and structures rather than just personal dominance and immediate physical threat. House governed his domain not through constant presence or direct intervention, but through carefully designed mechanisms that channeled behavior in desired directions while appearing to allow freedom and autonomy. The Securitrons provided enforcement when necessary, but the real control came from contracts, incentives, monitoring systems, and the subtle architecture of choices that made compliance easier and more profitable than resistance. The relationship between House and his tribal leaders was structured with meticulous attention to maintaining dependence while providing sufficient reward to ensure cooperation, a balance that required constant adjustment as circumstances changed and as the tribes gained experience in their new roles. House provided the casinos, the equipment, the security, and the legitimacy that made profitable operations possible, but he also retained ultimate authority over major decisions and extracted substantial tribute from their earnings. The tribal leaders managed day-to-day operations and enjoyed considerable wealth and status, but they remained fundamentally employees rather than independent operators, their power derived from House rather than possessed in their own right. Benny observed House's methods with the acute attention of someone who understood that power was not just something to be wielded, but something to be studied and comprehended in its mechanisms and principles. He watched how House used information advantage to maintain control, his surveillance systems providing comprehensive knowledge of activities throughout the Strip, while keeping his own operations opaque and mysterious. He noted how House employed multiple independent power centers, the three families playing off against each other in ways that prevented any single group from accumulating sufficient strength to challenge his authority. He learned how House managed perception, appearing reasonable and generous while structuring situations to ensure compliance with his preferences. The complex machinery of New Vegas that Benny came to understand through his work at the Tops was far more sophisticated than anything that existed elsewhere in the wasteland, a genuine recreation of pre-war urban civilization rather than the crude approximations that characterized most post-war settlements. Power flowed reliably through restored electrical grids. Water was purified and distributed through functioning pipes. Waste was managed through systems that prevented the accumulation of filth that plagued lesser communities. The casinos themselves operated according to carefully calibrated mathematical principles, their games designed to ensure house advantage while providing enough customer wins to maintain the illusion of opportunity and fairness. Understanding these systems required Benny to develop capabilities that went far beyond the practical intelligence needed for tribal survival, demanding comprehension of probability, statistics, logistics, personnel management, and the psychology of entertainment and addiction. House provided training materials and instruction, but Benny supplemented this formal education with his own research, reading pre-war texts on casino management and studying the operations of his establishment with obsessive attention to detail. He learned to read financial reports that tracked revenue and expenses across multiple categories, to identify patterns in customer behavior that could be exploited for profit, to recognize when employees were skimming or when systems were being manipulated by clever gamblers. The role of managing the Tops casino placed Benny in a position of genuine responsibility and authority that would have been impossible to achieve through tribal advancement, giving him command over dozens of employees and control over operations that generated substantial wealth. He coordinated the pit bosses who supervised gaming tables, ensuring that dealers followed proper procedures and that customers were not cheating the house. He managed the security personnel who maintained order without excessive violence, walking the delicate line between protecting the establishment and avoiding the kind of brutality that would discourage patronage. He oversaw the maintenance staff who kept the building functioning, the servers who provided food and drink, the entertainers who created atmosphere. Observing House's methods of control and management provided Benny with insights that went beyond the specific context of casino operations to illuminate general principles of how power functioned in organized societies. He saw how rules could be used to constrain behavior while appearing neutral and fair, how monitoring created self-discipline through awareness of being watched, how rewards could be more effective than punishments in shaping desired actions. He learned that the appearance of legitimacy was often more valuable than actual force, that people would comply with authority they perceived as proper even when they might resist naked coercion. These lessons, absorbed through years of close observation, would inform Benny's own eventual attempts to seize power. The relationship between House and Benny during this period was characterized by mutual utility, but not genuine trust, both parties recognizing the other's value while remaining alert to potential betrayal or exploitation. House valued Benny's competence and his ability to manage the tops effectively, but he also monitored him constantly through Securitron surveillance and informant networks, aware that ambitious subordinates posed potential threats to established authority. Benny respected House's intelligence and the systems he had created, but he also resented the subservient position these systems forced him to occupy, the constant reminders that his authority was delegated rather than inherent, that his success depended on House's continued approval. Growing understanding of power's true nature came to Benny through this period of service, revealing that dominance was rarely absolute but rather a matter of degree and context, that even House's seemingly total control over New Vegas depended on maintaining certain conditions and managing certain relationships. House needed the families to operate the casinos, because Securitrons alone could not create the human atmosphere that gambling required. He needed the NCR to provide customers and legitimacy, because New Vegas could not function in complete isolation from the wasteland's major powers. He needed his technology to continue functioning, because without the Securitrons and Lucky 38 systems, he would be just another old man, making claims to authority without means to enforce them. The aesthetic that Benny cultivated during his years managing the tops became integral to his identity and his effectiveness as a leader. The visual presentation of sophistication and control, reinforcing the psychological reality that he had transcended his tribal origins. The suits he wore were not merely clothing, but statements of identity, their checkered patterns and careful tailoring announcing to everyone who saw him that this was a man who understood style and possessed the resources to indulge aesthetic preferences. The way he moved through the casino, with measured confidence and controlled gestures, communicated authority without aggression, sophistication without weakness. The swagger that became Benny's signature mannerism was consciously developed rather than natural, a performance polished through repetition until it became second nature, projecting an image of easy confidence that made customers and employees alike perceive him as someone in complete command of his environment. His speech patterns, already refined through years of private study, were further honed during this period as he interacted daily with educated NCR tourists and learned to modulate his vocabulary and tone for different audiences. With customers, he was charming and approachable, his words chosen to put them at ease and encourage spending. With employees, he was clear and authoritative, his instructions leaving no doubt about expectations, while avoiding the kind of crude threats that would breed resentment. The style that Benny developed extended beyond personal presentation to encompass his entire approach to leadership and problem-solving, favoring indirect manipulation over direct confrontation. verbal skill over physical violence, strategic patience over impulsive action. Where his tribal chief had ruled through demonstrated capacity for brutality, Benny led through demonstrated competence and the careful cultivation of the perception that cooperation with him served others' interests. This approach was not just more civilized, but more effective in the casino context, where maintaining employee morale and customer satisfaction required subtlety that pure intimidation could never achieve. Daily operations of running the casino provided Benny with challenges that engaged his intelligence in ways that tribal raiding never had, each day bringing problems that required analysis and creative solutions rather than just application of force. A high roller complained about dealer behavior, requiring Benny to investigate whether the complaint was legitimate or merely the resentment of someone experiencing normal house advantage. Revenue dropped on certain games, demanding analysis of whether this reflected statistical variance or indicated problems with equipment or personnel. Tensions emerged between different groups of employees, necessitating interventions that resolved conflicts without damaging operational efficiency or creating lasting resentments. Managing relationships with NCR tourists who visited the tops required Benny to understand and navigate a culture quite different from both tribal society and House's autocratic system. The Republic's citizens expecting certain standards of service and fair dealing, while also bringing their own assumptions and prejudices about New Vegas and its operators. These visitors provided the majority of the top's revenue, their caps flowing into the casino's coffers in exchange for entertainment and the thrill of gambling. But they also demanded treatment that respected their status as citizens of a legitimate government rather than mere marks to be exploited. Benny learned to give them the experience they sought while still ensuring house advantage, to make them feel valued while extracting maximum profit from their patronage. Dealing with Legion spies, who occasionally infiltrated the Strip as part of Caesar's intelligence-gathering operations, required different skills entirely, as these agents were not customers seeking entertainment, but enemies seeking information and vulnerabilities. Benny developed networks of informants among his staff, who could identify suspicious appropriate for post-war realities. These rationalizations allowed Benny to view his planned betrayal as almost altruistic, motivated by concern for New Vegas's welfare rather than merely personal ambition. The carefully constructed fantasy of benevolent control that Benny developed during his months of planning allowed him to avoid confronting the possibility that his rule might prove no better than House's, or that his motivations were more self-serving than he cared to admit. In Benny's imagination, he was the enlightened leader that New Vegas deserved, someone who combined House's vision with human warmth and flexibility, someone who would preserve the best of the current system while eliminating its worst features. The fact that this vision bore remarkable similarity to standard authoritarian self-justification throughout history, the tyrant's eternal claim to know better than those they ruled, was something Benny either did not recognize or chose not to examine too closely. Rationalization that he would do better than the old man provided psychological cover for actions that Benny knew were fundamentally selfish and motivated primarily by his desire for power rather than abstract concern for good governance. But rationalization served important functions in maintaining psychological coherence and avoiding the paralysis that might result from too much honest self-examination, allowing Benny to pursue his goals with confidence and determination rather than doubt and hesitation. Whether he genuinely believed his own justifications or merely found them useful for maintaining focus and commitment was perhaps unclear even to Benny himself. The line between sincere conviction and cynical self-deception blurred by the psychological complexity of ambitious humans justifying morally questionable actions. Tracking the courier carrying the chip required Benny to develop intelligence networks and information sources outside House's knowledge and control, cultivating contacts among traveling merchants and NCR personnel who might provide advance warning of courier movements in the Western Mojave. The courier in question was apparently reliable and experienced, trusted by House with this crucial delivery, but also vulnerable in the way that all solitary travelers were vulnerable in a wasteland filled with raiders, creatures, and environmental hazards. The courier's route could be predicted with reasonable accuracy based on the most efficient paths between the NCR's core territories and New Vegas, and this predictability created the opportunity for interception that Benny's plan required. Choosing Goodsprings as the ambush point reflected careful analysis of geography, logistics, and risk. The small settlement providing the last convenient location for interception before the courier would reach areas where House's surveillance and NCR patrols made ambush impractical. The town itself was too small and isolated to pose significant threat of interference, its inhabitants unlikely to involve themselves in violence that did not directly affect their interests. The cemetery on Goodsprings' outskirts offered privacy and appropriate symbolism for what Benny planned, a location where a grave could be dug without immediate discovery, where a courier could be killed and buried with minimal risk of witnesses or complications. Assembling great Khans as disposable muscle for the actual interception demonstrated Benny's strategic thinking about deniability and risk management. His recognition that performing the killing personally would be unnecessary and potentially dangerous when tribal raiders could be hired to handle the violent aspects, while Benny himself maintained distance and claimed ignorance if anything went wrong. The Khans were experienced fighters desperate enough for Caps to accept work from New Vegas interests, their reputation for violence making them credible executors of an assassination, while their status as outsiders to strip politics meant they had no particular loyalty to House or interest in revealing who had hired them. Every detail of the plan was calculated and considered, from the timing that would ensure Benny could travel to Goodsprings and return to the Tops within a time frame that would not raise suspicions about his absence, to the backup scenarios that addressed potential complications, like the courier being more heavily guarded than expected, or the chip being concealed in ways that made recovery difficult. Benny had learned from years of casino management that successful operations required attention to details and preparation for contingencies, and he applied these lessons to planning what might be the most important operation of his life with appropriate thoroughness. Every angle covered meant accounting for potential witnesses who would need to be silenced, ensuring the Khans understood that leaving survivors was not acceptable, planning routes that avoided NCR patrols and House's Securitron positions, and preparing explanations for his movements that would satisfy anyone who might question his whereabouts during the relevant time frame. Benny's confidence in his planning was substantial but not absolute, his intelligence sufficient to recognize that even the most careful schemes could fail due to unforeseen factors or simple bad luck. But his ambition and the apparent perfection of the opportunity overrode his natural caution. Confidence, bordering on arrogance, characterized Benny's mental state as the date of the interception approached. His success in transforming from tribal raider to sophisticated casino operator, creating belief that he possessed special qualities that would ensure success in this far more dangerous venture. He had already achieved one seemingly impossible transformation. Why should he not achieve another? He had already killed one leader to claim power. Why should killing a courier and taking what they carried prove more difficult? The psychological momentum of past successes created expectations of future victories that were not entirely justified by objective analysis, but which provided the emotional energy necessary to commit to irreversible action. What could go wrong was a question Benny asked himself, only rhetorically, his mind generating answers, but dismissing them as unlikely or manageable, rather than seriously considering the possibility that fundamental assumptions might be flawed. The courier might survive, but 2 bullets to the head from close range made survival statistically improbable. The Khans might talk, but they had more to fear from House than to gain from honesty, and disposing of them after the job was complete would eliminate even that minimal risk. House might somehow discover the plan before its execution, but Benny's operational security had been meticulous, and Yes Man had detected no evidence that House suspected anything unusual. The plan would work because it had to work, because Benny needed it to work, because the alternative was accepting permanent subordinate status that had become psychologically intolerable. The courier's journey to Goodsprings followed routes that thousands of travelers had taken before. The roads and trails connecting the new California Republic's core territories to the Mojave, representing lifelines of commerce and communication that made civilization possible even in the harsh wasteland. This particular courier had accepted the delivery contract from the Mojave Express in Prim, the job seeming routine despite the unusual nature of the package and the premium payment offered for guaranteed delivery to the New Vegas Strip. The platinum chip itself was small enough to fit in a pocket, its physical insignificance belying the enormous value that both the sender and recipient placed on its safe arrival. And the courier carried it with the casual confidence of someone who had completed hundreds of similar deliveries without serious incident. The landscape through which the courier traveled was beautiful in the way that deserts can be beautiful. The late afternoon sun casting long shadows across red rocks and scrubland. The air crisp with the particular clarity that comes when moisture is absent and dust has settled. Goodsprings appeared on the horizon as a small cluster of buildings that represented one of the Mojave's countless minor settlements. Communities too small to attract much attention from major factions, but large enough to provide basic services to travelers who needed rest, supplies, or information about road conditions ahead. The courier had no particular reason to be cautious approaching such a place, no warning that this routine stop would become the site of betrayal and violence that would alter the course of Mojave history. Benny and the Khans had been waiting since before dawn, positioned in the cemetery on Goodsprings' outskirts where they could observe the most likely approach routes while remaining concealed from casual observation. The waiting itself was tedious and uncomfortable, the desert night giving way to morning chill and then afternoon heat. But Benny maintained focus through the discomfort by mentally rehearsing what would happen when the courier finally arrived. He had hired 3 Khans for the operation: Jessup, who seemed to be their informal leader; McMurphy, whose size and evident capacity for violence made him useful muscle; and a third whose name Benny had not bothered to learn but whose presence provided additional security against the unlikely possibility that the courier might prove more formidable than expected. The checkered jacket that Benny wore for this operation was not his finest suit, but rather a deliberately chosen garment that combined his signature style with practical considerations about potential bloodstains in the desert, environment's effects on expensive fabric. The unique pistol he carried, a 9mm weapon he had named Maria and decorated with ornate engravings that reflected his taste for aesthetic refinement, even in instruments of violence, was loaded and ready. Though Benny hoped that its actual discharge would not be necessary if the Khans performed their role effectively. The plan called for the Khans to control the courier physically, while Benny handled the interaction and secured the chip, minimizing his direct involvement in violence, while ensuring that he personally verified the package's recovery. The courier's arrival in the cemetery came exactly as predicted, the traveler having been directed there through a message claiming to offer information about a shortcut to New Vegas, the kind of helpful tip that experienced couriers often received from locals and rarely questioned unless given reason for suspicion. Benny stepped forward from his position of concealment, with the Khans flanking him, their weapons visible but not yet aimed. The tableau arranged to communicate threat while maintaining the possibility of a non-violent resolution if the courier proved unexpectedly cooperative. The late afternoon light caught the checkered pattern of Benny's jacket and glinted off Maria's polished surface, creating a visual impression that was almost theatrical in its careful composition. The confrontation that followed was brief and relatively professional, compared to the chaotic violence that characterized most wasteland ambushes, Benny's management of the situation reflecting his preference for controlled execution over impulsive brutality. He verified that this was indeed the courier House had hired, confirmed that the platinum chip was in their possession, and explained with almost apologetic courtesy that circumstances required him to relieve them of the package they carried. The courier's reaction, whether protest or attempted resistance or simple, shocked silence, did not significantly affect the outcome. The power disparity between a single traveler and three armed Khans, plus Benny himself making an army, from formidable to overwhelming, transforming House's military capabilities in ways that would eliminate any conceivable threat to his control over New Vegas and potentially enable expansion beyond the Strip into the wider Mojave. The technical specifications that Benny managed to access through a combination of social engineering and exploitation of security gaps indicated that the Platinum chip contained software upgrades that would enhance every Securitron on the project. Strip, improving their weapons systems, tactical programming, and operational capabilities to levels that pre-war military forces would have envied. House had apparently hidden a bunker beneath Fortification Hill, containing a vast army of Securitrons in storage, waiting to be activated and upgraded once the chip arrived, at which point his military advantage over both the NCR and Caesar's Legion would become so overwhelming that neither would dare challenge his authority or his territorial claims. The realization that this single piece of technology represented the difference between House's current position of carefully maintained balance with surrounding powers and absolute dominance over the entire region struck Benny with the force of revelation, transforming his vague dreams of somehow displacing House into something approaching a realistic possibility. If the chip was so crucial to House's plans, then possessing it himself would simultaneously deny House his intended advantage and provide Benny with the means to command an upgraded Securitron army for his own purposes. The chip was not just valuable but transformative, not just important but potentially decisive, the kind of leverage that could overturn established hierarchies and create opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. Research and planning in secret became Benny's consuming obsession during the months after he discovered the chip's significance. His mind constantly working through scenarios and strategies, even as he continued to perform his duties, managing the tops with the appearance of complete dedication. He could not pursue this goal openly or recruit assistance from anyone who might report his interest to House, so the planning had to be conducted in isolation. Each piece of the puzzle assembled privately and stored only in Benny's memory rather than in any physical record that might be discovered. The psychological burden of maintaining this secret while continuing to interact normally with House and the chairman was substantial, requiring constant vigilance to prevent any verbal or behavioral slip that might reveal his true focus. The chip's power to upgrade Securitrons and thereby control the Strip represented exactly the kind of technological leverage that could enable someone with Benny's intelligence and ambition to challenge House's seemingly unassailable position, providing military force that did not depend on personal loyalty or human psychology, but simply on possession of the appropriate command codes and control systems. House's entire power base rested on his monopoly over advanced technology, his Securitrons serving as the physical enforcement mechanism for his authority. But that monopoly could theoretically be broken if someone else gained access to the same technology and the means to direct it toward different ends. The realization that this was the key to everything, the single component whose possession would determine the future trajectory of New Vegas and potentially the entire Mojave, focused Benny's planning with laser intensity on the challenge of intercepting the chip before it reached House. Every other concern became secondary to this central goal. All his accumulated frustrations with subordinate status and all his ambitious dreams of independent power channeling into the single objective of possessing the Platinum chip. Success would mean everything he had ever wanted: freedom from House's authority, command over overwhelming military force, the opportunity to reshape New Vegas according to his own vision rather than someone else's directives. Obsession, growing into determination, transformed Benny's relationship to his daily responsibilities and his interactions with everyone around him. The secret knowledge of what he planned creating a psychological barrier between himself and even his most trusted associates. He could not share his plans with Swank or Tommy or anyone else in the chairmen because the risk of betrayal or inadvertent revelation was too great. House's surveillance systems too comprehensive to risk any communication that might be intercepted or reported. The isolation this imposed was profound, leaving Benny alone with schemes that grew more elaborate and ambitious with each day's further planning. Unable to test his assumptions against others' perspectives or receive feedback that might identify fatal flaws in his reasoning. The discovery of Yes Man represented one of those strokes of fortune that made Benny believe the universe itself was conspiring to enable his ambitions, providing exactly the resource he needed at precisely the moment when his plans required capabilities he had no other way to access. The Securitron was discovered during a routine inspection of basement areas beneath the strip, its presence unexplained by any documentation Benny could access. Its programming apparently designed to provide assistance to anyone who asked, regardless of their authorization or intentions. The discovery was so convenient as to seem suspicious, but investigation revealed that Yes Man was genuinely what he appeared to be, a reprogrammed Securitron whose core directives had been altered to make him helpful and compliant rather than loyal to House. The perfect servant that Yes Man represented was something Benny had not even known to hope for, a source of technical knowledge and operational assistance that could answer questions about House's systems without the loyalty protocols that made other Securitrons useless for planning betrayal. Yes, Man could explain how House's network functioned, identify vulnerabilities in security systems, provide detailed information about the Securitron Army's capabilities and command structure, and most importantly, help Benny understand how the platinum chip could be used once he possessed it. The AI's cheerful willingness to assist with planning that directly contradicted House's interests created cognitive dissonance that Benny never fully resolved. The suspicion that something so convenient might be trap-warring with the practical necessity of using the resources available, helpful, knowledgeable, and unable to refuse any request made of him. Yes, Man became Benny's primary source of intelligence about House's secrets and his most valuable ally in planning the heist that would secure the platinum chip. The Securitron's programming forced him to provide assistance, regardless of his own assessment of the request's wisdom or morality, creating a relationship fundamentally different from the human alliances that required constant management and negotiation. Benny could ask Yes Man anything and receive truthful, comprehensive answers. He could share his plans without fear that Yes Man would betray him to House or demand concessions in exchange for continued cooperation. The AI was, in effect, a slave whose servitude was guaranteed by programming rather than coercion, and Benny exploited this condition without apparent moral qualms. Learning House's secrets through Yes Man was like being handed the keys to a kingdom Benny had only glimpsed from outside. Each revelation about how New Vegas actually functioned, opening new possibilities for manipulation and control. He learned about the hidden bunker at Fortification Hill, where an army of Securitrons waited in storage, about the command protocols that would activate and control them once the platinum chip's upgrades were installed, about the weaknesses in House's surveillance systems that could be exploited by someone with knowledge of their architecture. Most valuable of all, he learned that House was not omniscient or invulnerable, but rather dependent on specific technologies and systems that could theoretically be seized or disrupted by a sufficiently well-informed and determined opponent. Planning the heist and what would follow consumed months of careful preparation, Benny's mind working through scenarios and contingencies with the same attention to detail that had made him successful as a casino manager, but now applied to far higher stakes. The courier carrying the chip would need to be intercepted before reaching the strip, killed or neutralized, to prevent any possibility of the chip reaching House. The chip itself secured and brought to Yes Man for analysis. and preparation for its intended use in Benny's hands rather than House's. The location of the interception would need to be remote enough to avoid witnesses, but accessible enough for Benny to reach and return without his absence from the tops being noticed and reported. Yes, Man's bunker beneath the strip became Benny's secret headquarters for planning and preparation. The hidden location providing privacy that was impossible to achieve anywhere subject to House's surveillance, while also offering access to the technical systems and knowledge that made sophisticated planning possible. Benny spent hours in the bunker during times when his absence from the tops could be explained as personal business or minor errands, working with Yes Man to refine the plan's details, studying the technical specifications of Securitron command systems, and imagining the moment when he would finally possess the leverage necessary to challenge House directly. The irony of using House's own technology against him was not lost on Benny. The poetic justice of being destroyed by the very systems that had enabled his dominance, appealing to Benny's sense of dramatic appropriateness, even as he recognized the practical advantages that superior knowledge of an opponent's capabilities provided. House had created the Securitron network as an instrument of control, never imagining that one of his subordinates would gain sufficient understanding of the system to potentially subvert it. Yes, Man existed only because someone, at some point, had reprogrammed a Securitron in ways that House either had not detected or had not considered threatening. These oversights and vulnerabilities, small in themselves, created the possibility of catastrophic failure in House's apparently impregnable position. Benny's dream of New Vegas independent and under his control took increasingly concrete form during this period of planning, evolving from vague fantasy into something approaching a realistic vision with specific goals and implementation strategies. He imagined the tops not as one casino among three families, but as the center of a new order, with himself as the sovereign authority, making decisions that currently required House's approval. He pictured the other families brought to heel or replaced with more compliant operators, the NCR and Legion forced to negotiate with him rather than attempt to dominate or conquer. The entire Mojave, recognizing New Vegas as an independent power that demanded respect rather than a prize to be claimed by whoever proved strongest. Upgrading the Securitron army for himself, rather than House, became the central component of this vision. The military force that would make independence viable, rather than merely aspirational, protecting New Vegas from external threats, while also ensuring that internal challenges to Benny's authority could be suppressed with overwhelming efficiency. The upgraded Securitrons would be loyal not to a pre-war autocrat in a basement, but to whoever controlled their command systems, and Benny intended to be that person, using Yes Man's assistance to ensure that the upgrades installed with the Platinum chip responded to his directives rather than House's. The technical challenges of achieving this reprogramming were substantial, but not insurmountable, according to Yes Man's analysis, requiring only possession of the chip and access to the Fortification Hill bunker where the Securitron army waited. Removing House without destroying the system he had created represented a more delicate challenge than simple assassination. As Benny understood that New Vegas's value lay not just in its physical assets, but in the functioning infrastructure and systems that House had painstakingly restored. Killing House was easy, in theory, simply a matter of accessing the Lucky 38 and destroying his life support systems, but doing so prematurely, or without having secured control of his technology, would leave Benny with ruins rather than a functioning city-state. The sequence of actions mattered enormously. First, secure the Platinum chip, then upgrade the Securitron army, then establish control over their command systems, and only after these preparations were complete move against House himself. A new order with Benny as Chairman Supreme was not presented, even in his private thoughts, as mere personal aggrandizement, but rather as superior governance that would benefit New Vegas and its inhabitants in ways that House's autocratic control never could. Benny told himself that he understood the city better than House did, that his years of actual interaction with customers and employees had given him insights that someone who never left his basement could not possess. He would be a more engaged ruler, more responsive to changing conditions, more willing to adapt and innovate rather than rigidly adhering to pre-war visions that might no longer be approaching the platinum chip to upgrade the Securitron army. Killing 3 Khans would create its own complications, potentially triggering investigations or revenge actions that would draw attention Benny wanted to avoid. And their deaths might actually increase rather than decrease the likelihood that someone would connect the Goodsprings killing to New Vegas interests. Better to maintain distance and hope that the Khans either kept silent or that their eventual talking would come too late to matter. Seeds of his unraveling were being planted during these early days after the heist. The choices Benny made about witness management and security creating vulnerabilities that would eventually contribute to his downfall. Perfect execution of a conspiracy required eliminating all evidence and witnesses, but Benny's reluctance to engage in mass murder beyond what was absolutely necessary meant that the Khans survived as potential sources of information, that the courier's body had been left in a findable grave rather than destroyed beyond recognition, that the trail of his involvement was obscured but not completely erased. The trail leading back to him growing clearer was a process that Benny remained unaware of during those first crucial weeks after Goodsprings. His attention focused entirely on the technical challenges of using the platinum chip, rather than on defensive measures against investigations he did not know were beginning. The courier's survival and quest for answers, House's growing suspicions about why the chip had not arrived, the Khan's loose lips in situations where they thought their words would not reach dangerous ears. All of these factors were creating a network of information that would eventually converge on Benny himself. But for now, he moved forward with his plans in ignorance of the forces gathering against him, confident that his careful planning had covered all the angles and that his transformation from subordinate to sovereign was proceeding exactly as intended. Back at the tops, Benny resumed his duties with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of maintaining appearances while concealing true thoughts and intentions. His interactions with employees and customers displaying the same casual competence and superficial warmth that had always characterized his public persona. The casino floor operated with its usual efficient rhythm, dealers managing their tables with professional detachment, security personnel maintaining order without excessive visibility, servers delivering drinks and collecting tips while navigating the complex social dynamics between gamblers experiencing winning and losing streaks. To anyone observing Benny during this period, he appeared to be exactly what he had always been, a successful casino manager focused on operational excellence and customer satisfaction. Maintaining appearances with House required even more careful performance. As the autocrat's intelligence and surveillance systems made deception far more challenging than fooling employees or customers who had no particular reason to scrutinize Benny's behavior for signs of betrayal. Their regular meetings continued on schedule, Benny reporting on the top's financial performance and operational issues with the same detail and apparent candor that had characterized their relationship for years, never allowing his voice or expression to betray the knowledge that he possessed, the very object House was waiting for with increasing impatience and concern. The psychological burden of sitting across from House while the platinum chip rested in Benny's pocket or hidden in his personal quarters was substantial, requiring constant vigilance to prevent any involuntary gesture or verbal slip that might trigger House's suspicions. Secret work with Yes Man became Benny's primary focus during hours when his presence at the tops was not required, or when he could plausibly claim to be conducting personal business away from the casino. The hidden bunker beneath the strip, serving as his true headquarters, where plans were refined and technical preparations made for the eventual use of the platinum chip. Yes, Man's analysis of the chip confirmed everything Benny had hoped, and more. The device containing precisely the software upgrades necessary to transform the Securitron army from formidable to overwhelming, its implementation requiring only access to the bunker at Fortification Hill, where the main army waited in storage, and the technical expertise to properly install and activate the upgrades. The chip in hiding represented a constant source of both anxiety and excitement for Benny. Its physical location changed regularly to minimize risk of discovery through house's surveillance, or through simple bad luck of someone stumbling upon it during routine activities. Sometimes it was concealed in the most obvious place, Benny's personal quarters at the tops, hidden within innocuous objects that would not attract attention during cursory searches. Other times, it was moved to the bunker with Yes Man, where House's monitoring systems had apparent blind spots that the reprogrammed Securitron had identified. The paranoia about its security was not irrational given the chip's value and the catastrophic consequences that would follow if House discovered Benny's theft before the plan could be fully executed. Plans progressing according to Benny's careful timeline involved multiple stages of preparation that needed to be completed before the final confrontation with House could be initiated, each stage presenting its own technical challenges and security risks. The Securitron army at Fortification Hill needed to be accessed without alerting Caesar's Legion to unusual activity in territories they claimed as their own, requiring careful timing and possibly negotiations or bribes to ensure safe passage. The upgrade process itself would take time, during which Benny would be vulnerable to discovery or attack, necessitating security measures that could protect him during the critical hours when the Securitrons were offline for software installation. Most importantly, control systems needed to be configured to respond to Benny's commands rather than House's, a reprogramming task that Yes Man assured him was possible but which introduced additional complexity and potential points of failure. The tension of living a double life permeated every aspect of Benny's existence during this waiting period. The constant awareness that he was betraying the man he ostensibly served, creating psychological pressure that found release only in the privacy of his quarters, or in the bunker, where he could speak freely with Yes Man about his actual plans and concerns. In public, he was the loyal chairman, the competent manager, the urbane operator who charmed customers and maintained profitable operations for House's benefit. In private, he was the conspirator and would-be usurper, the ambitious schemer whose every action served goals that directly contradicted the interests of his supposed employer. The cognitive dissonance between these two identities was manageable only through strict compartmentalization, keeping the public persona completely separate from private reality. Watching for any sign House suspected something required constant attention to the autocrat's communications and behavior. Analysis of whether questions or comments suggested growing awareness that Benny might be involved in the chip's non-arrival, or whether they simply reflected normal concern about a valuable delivery that had been delayed. House's surveillance systems monitored all activities on the strip with varying degrees of detail, but Benny had learned through years of observation where the gaps and limitations existed, which areas were watched constantly and which received only periodic attention, knowledge that allowed him to conduct suspicious activities during times and in locations where detection was least likely. House's questions about the chip's non-arrival began casually enough, inquiries that seemed motivated by simple concern about logistical delays rather than suspicion of deliberate interference. His tone suggesting that he expected mundane explanations, like raiders or environmental hazards, rather than coordinated theft by one of his own subordinates. Benny responded to these initial questions with appropriate concern and offers of assistance, suggesting that he could make inquiries through his contacts among traveling merchants and NCR personnel who might have information about courier movements or incidents along the usual routes between California and Nevada. These offers were calculated to demonstrate loyalty, while also potentially providing Benny with advance warning if House's own investigations began to produce evidence that connected the Goodsprings killing to New Vegas interests. Benny's carefully crafted lies about the chip's fate evolved as House's questioning became more persistent and detailed, each new fabrication building on previous statements, while introducing plausible explanations for why the delivery had failed to arrive on schedule. Perhaps the courier had encountered raiders and been forced to take a longer, safer route that would delay arrival by weeks. Maybe the package had been damaged in transit and required the courier to return to the sender for replacement, a process that would necessarily take substantial time. It was possible that NCR bureaucracy had interfered somehow, their border checkpoints and inspection procedures, sometimes causing delays for travelers carrying valuable items into the Mojave. Each explanation was designed to sound reasonable while also being impossible for House to definitively disprove without extensive investigation. Playing the concerned lieutenant required Benny to maintain appropriate emotional affect during these conversations, expressing worry about the chip's fate and frustration at the delivery delays, while never appearing too interested or too defensive, striking the delicate balance between engagement and detachment that innocent parties would naturally display. He volunteered information about his own attempts to track the courier's progress, mentioning contacts he had supposedly consulted and dead ends he had supposedly encountered, creating the impression of active assistance in solving the mystery, while actually ensuring that his own role remained concealed behind layers of false information and misdirection. The stress of deceiving the man, who sees everything manifested in physical symptoms that Benny worked to conceal through careful management of his public appearances, the tension headaches and disrupted sleep patterns and moments of anxiety that occasionally broke through his controlled exterior. House's intelligence and the comprehensiveness of his surveillance systems meant that deception required perfection, that any inconsistency or anomaly in Benny's behavior might trigger deeper investigation that could uncover the truth. The knowledge that House had survived for over 2 centuries, through combination of brilliance and paranoia, made every interaction feel like a test that Benny might fail through some subtle error of word choice or body language. House's growing suspicion was evident to anyone who paid close attention to his communications and the increasing frequency with which he raised the chip's absence in conversations, his questions becoming more specific and his tone shifting from casual concern towards something approaching interrogation. He began asking about Benny's own movements during the relevant time frame, ostensibly as part of general inquiries to all the family leaders about whether they had noticed anything unusual. But Benny recognized the questions as potential attempts to establish alibis or identify inconsistencies in stated whereabouts. The net was tightening, though whether House actually suspected Benny specifically or was simply conducting comprehensive investigation remained unclear. The timeline tightening created urgency that conflicted with the careful patience that successful conspiracy required, forcing Benny to balance the need for thorough preparation against the risk that delayed action would allow House to discover the theft before the Securitron army could be upgraded and secured. Moving too quickly would mean attempting to implement plans that were not fully ready, potentially leading to technical failures or security breaches that would doom the entire enterprise. Moving too slowly would give House additional time to investigate and potentially uncover evidence of Benny's involvement, leading to confrontation before Benny had secured the military force necessary to challenge House's authority. The optimal timing existed somewhere between these extremes, but determining exactly when that moment arrived required judgment about factors that were inherently uncertain and unpredictable. Rumors from the Mojave began filtering back to the Strip through the various information networks that connected New Vegas to the wider wasteland. Fragments of stories about someone asking questions in Goodsprings and other settlements along the courier routes. Descriptions of a traveler with distinctive scars on their head who seemed to be tracking something or someone with single-minded determination. These reports were initially vague and easy to dismiss as unrelated to Benny's concerns, the wasteland being full of people with grievances and quests that had nothing to do with platinum chips or New Vegas politics. But the accumulation of similar stories from multiple sources began to suggest a pattern that demanded attention. Word of someone asking about a man in a checkered jacket arrived through one of Benny's informants among the traveling merchants. The merchant having overheard conversations in Novak, where a scarred traveler had been inquiring about anyone matching Benny's description passing through during the time frame when the courier had been killed. The specificity of the description, including details about the checkered pattern and the distinctive pistol that Benny carried, suggested that this was not random curiosity but focused investigation by someone who had either witnessed the Goodsprings ambush or learned about it from witnesses who had survived. The implications were immediately clear to Benny. Somehow, impossibly, there was someone who connected him to the courier's death and was actively seeking him. Reports from informants about the courier's survival came initially as rumors so improbable that Benny dismissed them as wasteland mythology or confusion between different incidents and different people. Someone had survived being shot in the head and buried, the stories claimed, had been rescued by a doctor in Goodsprings and nursed back to health despite injuries that should have been fatal. This mysterious survivor was now traveling the Mojave, asking questions about the attack, gathering information about who had hired the Khans and what had been stolen, following a trail that apparently led toward New Vegas. The stories were too fantastical to be credible, Benny told himself, the kind of exaggerated tales that wasteland gossip generated through repetition and embellishment. But their persistence and consistency across multiple independent sources began to erode his certainty. Benny's disbelief, turning to concern, was a gradual process, as accumulating evidence made the impossible seem merely improbable, and then probable, and finally, almost certain. The realization that the courier had somehow survived, forcing complete re-evaluation of his security situation and timeline for action. If the courier really was alive and investigating the Goodsprings attack, then Benny's carefully maintained secrecy was compromised in ways that made previous concerns about the Khans talking seem trivial by comparison. A survivor with personal knowledge of the attack and motivation for revenge represented a threat that could not be managed through payments or vague warnings. Someone who would not stop investigating until they found answers and achieved whatever justice or vengeance they sought. Contingency planning for this new threat consumed Benny's attention during the days after the courier's survival became undeniable. His mind working through scenarios that ranged from attempting to kill the courier again before they reached the strip to trying to negotiate some kind of settlement that would satisfy their desire for answers without exposing Benny's larger plans. Flight was considered as an option, abandoning New Vegas entirely and seeking opportunities elsewhere in the wasteland. But this alternative felt like defeat and meant giving up everything he had worked toward for years. Fighting seemed more appealing but required careful planning, as a second assassination attempt that failed would confirm guilt and potentially trigger responses from House or other factions that would doom any chance of implementing his schemes. The options narrowing, as the courier apparently drew closer to New Vegas, created psychological pressure that intensified daily, Benny's previous confidence in his planning giving way to anxiety about factors he had not anticipated and could not fully control. He had accounted for so many contingencies in his original scheme, had planned so carefully for dealing with House and managing the Securitron upgrade and securing his position. But he had not planned for the courier's survival because that possibility had seemed too remote to merit serious consideration. Now that impossibility had become reality, and Benny found himself improvising responses to a threat that undermined the foundation of his entire conspiracy. Preparing for confrontation meant acknowledging that the waiting game was ending, and that action would soon be forced regardless of whether all preparations were complete. The courier's investigation, creating a timeline that Benny no longer fully controlled. He began making arrangements for rapid departure from the strip, if escape became necessary, securing supplies and establishing routes that would allow him to reach the Fortification Hill bunker, even if House's Securitrons were actively pursuing him. He warned his most trusted associates that unusual events might occur soon without explaining specifics, but ensuring they would be prepared to act on short notice if circumstances demanded. Most importantly, he accelerated his technical preparations with Yes Man, pushing to complete the work necessary to use the platinum chip, even if the ideal conditions for its implementation had not yet materialized. The psychological pressure of these converging threats manifested in Benny's deteriorating sleep quality and increasing reliance on alcohol and chems to manage anxiety that threatened to interfere with his ability to maintain the public persona that security required. The cool, confident operator that customers and employees saw during business hours was increasingly a performance that required conscious effort to sustain, the mask threatening to slip during moments of stress or fatigue. When maintaining perfect control became difficult, Benny caught himself making small errors in judgment and communication that would have been unthinkable during his years of careful cultivation of professional competence. Mistakes that fortunately went unnoticed or were attributed to normal human variation rather than signs of deeper disturbance. Nights of broken sleep brought dreams that mixed memories of Good Springs Cemetery with fantasies of triumph and nightmares of discovery and failure. The courier's face appearing sometimes as it had looked in the moment before the shooting, and sometimes transformed into something accusatory and vengeful. Benny would wake from these dreams with heart pounding and skin cold with sweat, the boundary between sleeping anxiety and waking stress becoming increasingly permeable as the situation's pressure mounted. The isolation inherent in his conspiracy meant he could not share these burdens with anyone who might offer comfort or perspective, could not seek advice about managing stress because explaining the source of that stress would require revealing secrets that absolutely could not be shared. The loneliness of the ambitious had never been more apparent than during these weeks of waiting for the courier's arrival, while maintaining perfect deception before House and the entire apparatus of New Vegas society. Benny had chosen this path deliberately, had understood from the beginning that seizing power would require betrayal and deception, and the acceptance of isolation from genuine human connection. But intellectual understanding of these costs did not make their emotional reality easier to bear. He was utterly alone with his schemes and fears, surrounded by people but unable to truly share himself with any of them, playing roles for every audience, while his authentic self existed only in private moments that became increasingly rare and brief. The realization that his perfect plan had contained a fatal flaw, that all his careful preparation had not accounted for the courier's improbable survival, created doubt that spread beyond this specific oversight to call into question his general competence and judgment. If he had been wrong about something as fundamental as whether the courier was dead, what other assumptions might prove incorrect when tested by reality? Had he overestimated his ability to control the Securitrons once upgraded, or underestimated House's capacity to detect and counter betrayal, or miscalculated the responses that the NCR and Legion might make to his bid for independent control? These questions had no comfortable answers, and dwelling on them threatened to create paralysis at exactly the moment when decisive action was most necessary. Yet beneath the anxiety and doubt, Benny's fundamental ambition remained intact, and perhaps even intensified by the challenges he faced. His determination to see his plans through, hardened by the recognition that he had already committed too deeply to retreat without catastrophic consequences. He had killed for the platinum chip, had betrayed House's trust, had set in motion a conspiracy, any resistance purely symbolic rather than practically viable. The game was rigged from the start, and both participants in this lethal transaction understood that fact with perfect clarity, though only Benny knew the full significance of what was being taken and why this particular theft justified murder rather than simple robbery. For the courier, this was presumably just catastrophically bad luck, being in the wrong place at the wrong time with a package someone else wanted badly enough to kill for. For Benny, this was the culmination of months of planning and the beginning of his transformation from subordinate to sovereign, the moment when he would seize control of his destiny rather than accepting the limitations that House's authority imposed. The execution was conducted with cold efficiency that Benny had not personally demonstrated before, but which came to him with disturbing ease when circumstances demanded. The months of planning and psychological preparation making the actual pulling of the trigger feel almost anticlimactic compared to the elaborate mental rehearsals that had preceded it. 2 shots to the head from close range, the characteristic double tap that professionals use to ensure lethality, Maria's report echoing across the cemetery and disturbing carrion birds from their perches on weathered headstones. The courier dropped instantly, consciousness extinguished so quickly that death probably came before the body hit the ground. And Benny stood for a moment, looking down at what he had done, with an expression that combined satisfaction at successful execution with the faint discomfort that even hardened killers sometimes feel when ending human life. The retrieval of the platinum chip from the courier's body was accomplished, with hands that trembled slightly despite Benny's efforts at control. The physical reality of holding the object that would transform his life, creating emotional responses that months of abstract planning had not prepared him for. The chip itself was unimpressive to look at, just a small disc of platinum with embedded circuitry, but Benny handled it with reverent care, understanding that this seemingly insignificant object represented power that most people in the wasteland could not even conceptualize. He verified its authenticity through markings that Yes Man had described, confirmed that it was undamaged by the violence of its acquisition, and secured it in an inner pocket of his jacket, where it would remain safe during the journey back to New Vegas. Leaving the courier in a shallow grave was a practical necessity rather than a gesture toward decency or respect for the dead, the body needing to be concealed to delay discovery and reduce the likelihood that House would learn of the interception before Benny had time to implement the next stages of his plan. The Khans handled the actual digging and burial with the casual efficiency of men who had disposed of bodies before. Their conversation during this labor focused on practical matters of depth and concealment, rather than any philosophical or moral considerations about the life they had just ended. Benny supervised without participating physically in the burial, maintaining the psychological distance between himself and the crude violence that his plans had required, preserving his self-image as a sophisticated operator who employed force when necessary, but did not personally engage in the kind of brutish labor that characterized common raiders. The journey back to the Strip began immediately after the burial was complete. Benny, wanting to maximize the time between the killing and any potential discovery, while also ensuring that his absence from the tops did not extend long enough to generate questions or suspicions, he traveled separately from the Khans, who would return to their own territories with the caps he had promised them and presumably celebrate their easy payday without understanding the significance of what they had participated in. The separation was deliberate, Benny wanting to minimize association between himself and the hired muscle in case questions were later asked about the courier's fate, though he recognized that the Khans themselves represented potential security risks that might eventually need to be addressed. Processing what he had done occupied Benny's mind during the long drive back to New Vegas, his thoughts oscillating between triumph at having secured the chip and unease about having crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He had killed his tribal chief to enable transformation, but that had been almost abstract in its political nature, a necessary removal of an obstacle to collective survival. This killing was more personal and more calculated, motivated purely by his own ambition rather than any broader justification, and the courier had been innocent of any wrongdoing beyond accepting a delivery contract that happened to conflict with Benny's schemes. The weight of this moral distinction was something Benny felt but chose not to examine too closely, focusing instead on the practical achievement of having secured the chip and the opportunities this success created. The Khan witnesses represented a complication that Benny had anticipated in his planning but had not fully resolved, their presence at the killing creating potential security risks that might eventually threaten the secrecy his plans required. Jessup, McMurphy, and the third Khan had all seen Benny's face clearly, knew his name or could easily learn it, and understood that someone connected to New Vegas had hired them to kill a courier and steal a valuable package. These were not particularly intelligent or politically sophisticated men, but they were not stupid either, and the unusual nature of the job combined with the premium payment, might eventually lead them to speculate about what they had participated in and whether that knowledge could be leveraged for additional profit. Confidence that the courier was dead was absolute in Benny's mind, based on his understanding of human physiology and the lethality of the wounds he had inflicted. 2 9mm rounds to the head at close range was massive trauma that no human could survive, the bullets having certainly penetrated the skull and destroyed critical brain tissue necessary for life. Even if by some miracle the courier had not died instantly, they would have bled out within minutes, and the shallow burial ensured that even if some spark of life had persisted, suffocation would have finished what the bullets had started. The possibility of survival simply did not merit consideration in Benny's assessment, falling into the category of impossible outcomes that planning need not address. The chip in his possession represented vindication of months of careful planning and proof that he possessed the qualities necessary for the kind of audacious action that separated successful power seekers from timid subordinates who accepted whatever positions they were assigned. Benny allowed himself a moment of pure satisfaction as he drove through the wasteland darkness toward the lights of New Vegas visible on the horizon, his fingers occasionally touching the pocket where the chip rested to confirm its reality, to verify that this was not some elaborate fantasy, but actual achievement that would enable everything he had dreamed about during his years of frustrated service to House. Return to the tops required Benny to transition immediately from the role of killer and thief to the persona of professional casino operator, the psychological shift accomplished through practiced discipline and the same ability to compartmentalize that had allowed him to maintain appearances during months of secret planning. He entered through back passages that avoided the main casino floor where his absence might have been noticed, changed from the checkered jacket that had been worn during the killing into fresh clothing more appropriate for his managerial duties, and verified that no messages or crises had emerged during his absence that would require immediate attention or explanation for where he had been. Playing it cool meant behaving exactly as he always had, conducting business with the same casual competence and superficial charm that characterized his normal interactions, giving no indication through word or gesture that anything had changed or that he possessed something that would transform the power dynamics of New Vegas once its potential was properly exploited. Benny moved through the casino greeting regular customers, consulting with Swank about operational matters, addressing minor employee issues with his characteristic mix of authority and accessibility, all the while maintaining perfect composure despite the knowledge of what he carried and what he planned to do with it. The hours and days following the killing were among the most psychologically demanding of Benny's life. The constant awareness that he had murdered someone and stolen from House, creating pressure that had to be contained and concealed beneath layers of performance and misdirection. He attended meetings with House as though nothing had changed, expressing appropriate concern when the courier's failure to arrive was first noted, offering to assist with inquiries about what might have delayed the delivery, his face and voice betraying none of the guilty knowledge that the delay was permanent and that the chip House waited for was actually in Benny's possession, mere feet away during their conversations. What Benny did not know, could not have known despite his intelligence and planning, was that Doc Mitchell, the physician who had retired to Goodsprings after a career serving in the wider wasteland, had found the courier's shallow grave through the kind of fortunate accident that occasionally disrupts even the most careful schemes. The doctor's evening walk had taken him past the cemetery at a time when the fresh-turned earth was visible in moonlight, and his medical training had compelled him to investigate the possibility that someone might need help, his shovel breaking through the loose soil to reveal a body that had not yet grown cold and stiff with death's finality. The miracle of survival that followed was less miracle than the convergence of multiple, improbable factors that individually would have been insufficient, but together created the possibility of continued life. The bullets had damaged the courier's skull and brain tissue, but had somehow missed the specific structures whose destruction would have caused immediate death, the angles of impact creating wounds that were catastrophically severe but not quite fatal. The shallow burial had left enough air circulation to prevent suffocation during the critical minutes between burial and discovery. Most importantly, Doc Mitchell's skills and resources, honed through decades of wasteland medicine and supplemented by pre-war equipment he had maintained in working order, were exactly sufficient to stabilize the courier and prevent the secondary complications that would have killed someone who had survived the initial trauma. Benny's fatal assumption that no one survived 2 headshots was based on reasonable statistical analysis of normal circumstances, but failed to account for the extreme tail probabilities that occasionally manifested in reality, the 1 in a million coincidences that made the impossible merely highly improbable. The shots had been lethal by every reasonable standard, and under normal circumstances, the courier would have died exactly as Benny expected. But circumstances had not been normal, and the narrow margin between death and survival had been bridged through a combination of anatomical luck, quick discovery, and expert medical intervention that Benny could not have anticipated or planned around. The courier's recovery from injuries that should have been fatal was gradual and painful, consciousness returning slowly over days as swelling decreased and the brain began to compensate for damaged tissue. Memories of what had happened, fragmentary and confused, but eventually coalescing into clear recollection of the ambush, the checkered jacket, the distinctive pistol, and most importantly, the face of the man who had pulled the trigger. The quest for answers that began once the courier could travel was motivated partly by the simple human desire for revenge against someone who had tried to kill them, but also by the professional obligation to complete the delivery that had been interrupted, to understand why a routine package had been worth murder, to find out who had hired the Khans and what the platinum chip actually was. The ripple effect, beginning from the courier's survival, would eventually touch every aspect of Mojave politics and transform the carefully balanced power structure that House, the NCR, and Caesar's Legion had maintained through mutual deterrence and calculated restraint. One person with a bullet-scarred head and a burning need for answers, one survivor who should have been dead, would become the catalyst for changes that would determine whether New Vegas remained House's domain, fell to outside conquest, or achieved the independence that Benny dreamed about, though not in the way he imagined or under the leadership he assumed would be his. The Great Khan's doubts about working with Benny had begun even before they left Goodsprings Cemetery. The unusual nature of the job and the obvious importance of the package, creating questions about who had really hired them and what larger schemes they might have become unwitting participants in. Jessup, in particular, possessed enough intelligence and experience with wasteland politics to recognize that killing a courier for a platinum chip suggested connections to New Vegas power struggles. And the man in the checkered suit who had hired them had obviously been someone significant, despite his claims to be merely an intermediary for unnamed employers. Jessup's suspicions and knowledge represented exactly the kind of security risk that Benny had worried about when planning the operation. The Khan's memories and speculations, creating potential connections between the courier's death and Benny himself, that could eventually be traced by anyone investigating with sufficient determination and resources. The fact that Jessup knew Benny's face, had heard his voice, had witnessed his interaction with the courier, and possessed the intelligence to potentially piece together what had really happened, made him a loose end that proper operational security would demand that be eliminated. Benny's attempts to tie up loose ends began with offers of additional payment to the Khans in exchange for their silence about the Goodsprings job, the caps representing both reward for discretion and implicit threat about the consequences of talking. He made vague references to powerful employers who valued confidentiality and dealt harshly with those who threatened it, allowing the Khans to draw their own conclusions about what might happen if they discussed their role in the courier's death. These attempts were partially successful in securing the Khan's cooperation, but Benny recognized that purchase silence was never absolutely reliable, that circumstances might change in ways that made selling information more valuable than maintaining confidentiality. The decision to cut ties with the Khans, rather than silencing them permanently through murder, reflected Benny's calculation that the risks of killing them outweighed the benefits, at least in the short term, while he focused on the more critical challenge of use but simply injustice or revenge. Their determination to hold Benny accountable for the Goodsprings attack, overriding any appeals to self-interest or shared goals. The platinum chip itself became less important in these moments than simple survival. Benny's grand ambitions suddenly seeming hollow when measured against the immediate prospect of dying in his own casino at the hands of someone he had failed to kill properly the first time. The choice to flee to the fort represented Benny's calculation that Caesar's legion, despite being enemies of New Vegas generally and potential threats to his own schemes specifically, offered the best chance of survival when House's protection was no longer available and the courier had proven impossible to eliminate or manipulate. The Legion maintained an embassy on the Strip and camps throughout the Mojave, their military strength rivaling the NCR's and their political ambitions, creating potential alignment with anyone who opposed House's authority. Caesar himself was known to be interested in acquiring the platinum chip for his own purposes, having learned of its existence through his intelligence networks. And Benny calculated that offering the chip in exchange for protection might create a temporary alliance that would save his life while he planned his next moves. Desperation, replacing calculation in Benny's decision-making, as the confrontation in the suite reached its crisis point, manifested in choices that his earlier, more composed self would have recognized as mistakes, but which seemed like the only options available to someone whose carefully constructed plans had completely unraveled. The flight from the tops was hasty and poorly planned, compared to the meticulous preparation that had characterized Benny's earlier actions, driven by immediate need for survival rather than long-term strategic thinking. He grabbed the platinum chip and whatever weapons and supplies he could carry quickly, abandoned his position and everything he had built at the casino, and made his way through back passages toward the Strip's edge, where he could reach Legion-controlled territory. Benny's escape from the tops required him to evade not just the courier, but also potentially House's Securitrons, if the autocrat had learned about the confrontation and decided that Benny's flight indicated guilt worthy of immediate sanction. The route Benny took through the Strip's service tunnels and back alleys was one he had scouted during his preparations for various contingencies, but executing it under pressure while carrying valuable items and watching for pursuit tested his physical capabilities and nerve in ways that managing a casino never had. Each corner might conceal enemies, each shadow might hide someone waiting to intercept him, the paranoia that had been psychological during the waiting period now becoming immediate and justified by the circumstances he had created. The decision to seek Legion protection was made during the flight itself, rather than being part of any pre-existing plan. Benny's mind working through diminishing options and recognizing that Caesar represented the only power in the Mojave capable of standing against both House and a vengeful courier long enough for new strategies to be developed. The Legion's camps east of the Colorado River were accessible through routes that Benny knew from his intelligence gathering about regional politics, and their forces were substantial enough that even House would hesitate before attacking them directly. Most importantly, Caesar was known to be pragmatic about temporary alliances when they served his interests, willing to negotiate with people he might eventually crucify if the immediate tactical situation warranted cooperation. The gamble that Caesar would serve as temporary shield rather than immediate executioner was based on Benny's understanding of the Legion's strategic interests and Caesar's personal psychology, the warlord being intelligent enough to recognize the platinum chip's value and potentially interested in using Benny's knowledge of New Vegas and House's systems for his own purposes. Offering the chip as tribute might secure not just protection but actual alliance. Caesar's ambitions to conquer New Vegas, aligning with Benny's desire to see House removed from power, even if their ultimate visions for the city diverged significantly. The enemy of my enemy might not be a friend, but in desperate circumstances they could be a useful temporary partner. Travel to the fort with the chip represented Benny's commitment to this desperate strategy. The journey across Legion-controlled territories, requiring him to make contact with their patrols and communicate his desire for audience with Caesar himself, rather than simply being killed or enslaved as most New Vegas operators would be if captured in Legion lands. Benny's charm and gift for persuasion were tested in new ways as he attempted to convince Legion centurions and frumentari that he was valuable enough to warrant safe passage to their leader, that the platinum chip he carried and the knowledge he possessed about House's systems justified breaking standard protocols about how New Vegas representatives were treated when found in Legion territory. The irony of running from one master to another was not lost on Benny even as desperation drove him toward the fort. The recognition that his bid for independence had collapsed into seeking protection from an autocrat, potentially more ruthless and demanding than House himself, creating bitter awareness of how completely his plans had failed. He had sought to be his own master, to rule New Vegas according to his own vision, and instead he was reduced to supplicant status before a warlord whose ideology and methods represented everything Benny had tried to transcend through his cultivation of civilized sophistication. But survival took precedence over pride, and if groveling before Caesar was the price of staying alive long enough to potentially salvage something from the wreckage of his schemes, then Benny was prepared to pay that price. Benny's hope to negotiate and escape represented the final remnants of his belief that intelligence and charm could still salvage his situation, that even in the depths of failure he retained capabilities that could be leveraged to create new opportunities. Caesar might offer protection in exchange for the chip and information about House, but surely that protection would not be permanent imprisonment. Surely there would be moments when escape was possible, or when Benny's value as an ally would create opportunities to renegotiate the terms of their relationship. These hopes were perhaps unrealistic, given Caesar's well-known tendency to treat allies as temporary conveniences, and his general practice of eliminating anyone who might pose future threats. But Benny clung to them as alternatives to the despair that would follow from fully accepting how completely he had lost control of his destiny. Variations in Benny's fate, based on the courier's choices during their confrontation at the tops, created multiple possible endings to this chapter of his story, each reflecting different decisions about violence, mercy, and justice. The possibility of immediate death if the courier chose to shoot Benny in the suite, rather than allowing him to flee, represented the quickest and perhaps cleanest resolution. Violence, begetting violence in a wasteland, where scores were often settled with bullets rather than words or legal proceedings. A courier who had tracked Benny across the Mojave and confronted him in his own establishment might decide that conversation was pointless, that the man who had shot them in the head deserved nothing except the same treatment returned with interest. Benny's last words and thoughts in scenarios where he died at the tops would vary depending on exactly how the killing occurred and how much time he had to recognize his approaching end, but most versions would likely include some mixture of regret, defiance, and surprise that his story was ending in his own casino, rather than on a throne of power or in peaceful old age. The regret would focus on opportunities missed and plans that failed to account for improbable contingencies. The recognition that he had been killed by his own inadequate thoroughness in ensuring the courier's death at Goodsprings. The defiance would manifest in refusal to beg or plead, maintaining dignity even in defeat, because surrender of self-respect would be a final humiliation worse than death itself. The surprise would come from the sheer unlikelihood of the sequence of events that had brought him to this end, the improbability that should have protected him instead, becoming the mechanism of his destruction. The quick end to grand ambitions that death at the tops would represent carried certain mercy in its swiftness, sparing Benny the prolonged suffering and humiliation that other fates might impose, while also preventing any possibility of redemption or recovery. Everything he had worked for, all the careful planning and bold action and ruthless betrayal, would end in a moment of violence that reduced his story to a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreach and inadequate preparation. The platinum chip would pass to the courier who had died for it and lived to reclaim it. Benny's vision of independent New Vegas dying with him and leaving the city's fate to be determined by other actors in the Mojave's ongoing power struggles. What died with him in these scenarios extended beyond his physical existence to encompass the particular vision of New Vegas that only Benny could have implemented. The unique combination of pre-war sophistication and wasteland pragmatism that his leadership would have represented. House's autocracy, or NCR's bureaucracy, or Legion's tyranny might eventually prevail, but none of them would have produced the kind of independent, flamboyant city-state that Benny had imagined, where style mattered as much as strength, and where a former tribal raider could rule through charm and intelligence rather than inherited authority or military conquest. That vision, whatever its merits or flaws, would be buried with Benny in whatever grave the tops provided, or in whatever disposal method the courier chose for his corpse. The chip changing hands again would complete a circuit that had begun with House's commission, passed through Benny's theft, and ended with the courier's repossession. The object's journey mirroring the larger struggles for power and meaning that defined existence in the post-apocalyptic world. The courier who had died and been reborn would possess not just the chip but also the choice of what to do with it, whether to complete the original delivery to House, or use it for their own purposes, or destroy it to prevent anyone from accessing its power. Benny's death would remove him from this decision-making process, his agency ending with his life and his influence on the Mojave's future reduced to whatever consequences flowed from his failed attempt to seize power and the vendetta his actions had created in the courier's heart. Arrival at the fort marked the completion of Benny's journey from the glittering sophistication of the Strip to the brutal simplicity of Caesar's domain. The contrast between these two worlds so stark as to create cognitive dissonance in anyone who experienced both within a short time frame. The Legion's main encampment, east of the Colorado River, was organized with military precision that reflected Caesar's obsession with discipline and hierarchical order. Its tents and training grounds arranged in patterns that maximized efficiency, while communicating through their very layout the absolute authority of the man who commanded this army. Securitrons and neon signs gave way to standards topped with bull imagery and the constant presence of armed men whose bodies bore scars from countless battles and whose eyes reflected the kind of fanaticism that came from complete ideological commitment. Caesar's hospitality, such as it was, extended only to the minimal courtesies required by his self-image as a sophisticated leader rather than a mere bandit warlord. His treatment of Benny, calculated to demonstrate both power and the possibility of mercy, while never allowing the visitor to forget who held absolute authority in this space. Benny was not immediately killed or tortured as many New Vegas operators would have been if captured in Legion territory. His possession of the platinum chip and his knowledge of House's systems granting him temporary value that overrode the Legion's general hostility toward the decadent gambling culture that Benny represented. But hospitality did not mean freedom or safety, merely postponement of judgment until Caesar had extracted whatever usefulness Benny might provide. Caesar's true intentions became clear through the conditions of Benny's confinement and the nature of their initial conversations. The warlord, making evident that he viewed the casino operator not as a potential ally, but as a resource to be exploited and then disposed of when no longer useful. The platinum chip interested Caesar greatly, his intelligence about House's plans having revealed enough about the device's significance to make him recognize its potential value, but Caesar's interest was purely extractive rather than collaborative. He wanted the chip for his own purposes, wanted Benny's knowledge about how to use it, and once these assets had been transferred, Benny himself would become expendable, his fate determined by Caesar's whim rather than any contractual obligation or reciprocal loyalty. Benny, imprisoned in the weather station that served as the fort's detention facility for valuable prisoners, found himself stripped of the trappings that had defined his identity for years. The physical removal of his possessions, mirroring the psychological, stripping away of the persona he had so carefully constructed. The checkered jacket that had been his signature garment, the symbol of his transformation from tribal raider to sophisticated operator, was taken along with Maria and all his other personal effects, leaving him in simple clothing that erased individual identity and reduced him to generic prisoner status. The loss of these physical markers of identity was more disturbing than might seem rational, their absence creating a sense of nakedness and vulnerability that went beyond mere physical exposure. The checkered jacket taken and identity erased represented Caesar's deliberate strategy of breaking down prisoners psychologically before judging or using them. The removal of personal effects serving the dual purpose of preventing escape attempts while also undermining the self-conception that might give prisoners strength to resist interrogation or refuse cooperation. Benny, without his suit, was forced to confront how much of his constructed identity had depended on external symbols, how thin the veneer of civilization was when stripped of its supporting props. The tribal raider that he thought he had transcended began to emerge again in this stripped-down state, responses and thought patterns from his boot rider days resurfacing as the sophisticated casino operator identity lost its anchoring in material reality. Held in the weather station with other prisoners and detainees, Benny experienced a form of captivity fundamentally different from anything his previous life had prepared him for. The complete loss of agency and control, creating psychological stress that no amount of charm or intelligence could alleviate. Caesar's guards were not susceptible to manipulation through the techniques that had worked so effectively in New Vegas. Their ideological commitment to the Legion and fear of their leader's punishment, making them immune to bribes or appeals to self-interest. The other prisoners offered no potential for alliance or escape assistance, most of them being broken individuals awaiting execution or enslavement, their spirits crushed by Legion brutality in ways that made cooperation or resistance equally impossible. The reversal of fortune complete in Benny's imprisonment at the fort represented not just a temporary setback, but a fundamental inversion of the power dynamics he had taken for granted during his years managing the tops. The man who had commanded staff and manipulated powerful actors, now reduced to waiting helplessly for decisions made by others about his fate. The elaborate plans that had consumed his thoughts for months became irrelevant in circumstances where he possessed no resources and no leverage, where survival depended entirely on Caesar's assessment of his usefulness rather than any actions Benny himself could take. The psychological adjustment required to accept this powerlessness was something Benny struggled with continuously, his mind still generating schemes and strategies, even though rational analysis indicated that escape or negotiation were essentially impossible given the fort's security and his complete lack of assets. Caesar's perspective on Benny combined amusement at his presumption with contempt for his failure. The warlord, viewing the casino operator as an object lesson in the superiority of Legion discipline over the decadent individualism that New Vegas represented, that would end either in his elevation to power or in his death or permanent exile from everything he had built. There was no path back to the comfortable subordination he had known before Goodsprings, no way to undo what had been done or to restore relationships that had been irrevocably damaged by his choices. Forward was the only direction available, toward confrontation and resolution that would determine whether his ambitions had been visionary brilliance or fatal hubris, whether Benny the chairman would become Benny the sovereign or simply Benny the fool who had reached too far and fallen. The courier's arrival at the tops was announced not through any dramatic entrance or confrontation, but through the mundane reporting systems that monitored all visitors to the casino. Security personnel, noting the new arrival in their logs, and floor managers, observing another potential customer entering the gaming area to try their luck at the tables and slots. But Benny's network of informants, carefully cultivated over years of managing the establishment, quickly identified this particular visitor as someone unusual. The distinctive scars on their head and the intensity with which they surveyed the casino floor, suggesting purposes beyond simple entertainment or gambling. Word reached Benny within minutes of the courier's entrance, delivered by a pit boss who understood without being told that his employer would want to know about this specific individual immediately. Benny's recognition of the courier was instantaneous and visceral, despite the changes that survival and recovery had wrought. The face he had last seen in Goodspring Cemetery, now marked by surgical scars, and the kind of hardness that came from surviving what should have been fatal and pursuing vengeance across hundreds of miles of dangerous wasteland. The shock of seeing someone he had personally killed and buried walking through his casino as though risen from the dead created a moment of complete psychological disorientation, reality and impossibility colliding in ways that Benny's rational mind struggled to process. But the disorientation lasted only seconds before his survival instincts and strategic training reasserted control, his mind immediately beginning to calculate options and responses to this crisis that he had hoped would never materialize. Quick thinking in response to the courier's presence required Benny to make immediate decisions about whether to flee, fight, or attempt some form of engagement that might diffuse the threat through conversation or misdirection. Flight was possible, the tops having multiple exits, and Benny having prepared escape routes for exactly this kind of emergency. But running would confirm guilt and abandon everything he had built, while likely only delaying confrontation rather than avoiding it permanently. Fighting was complicated by the public setting and the impossibility of knowing whether the courier had come alone or with allies positioned throughout the casino. An ambush in his own establishment, potentially turning into a bloodbath that would draw House's immediate and overwhelming response. That left engagement as the least bad option, attempting to control the situation through the same combination of charm and manipulation that had served Benny throughout his career. The public meeting that Benny orchestrated by approaching the courier before they could cause a scene or attract unwanted attention was a masterpiece of performance under pressure, his demeanor projecting casual friendliness and mild surprise at seeing someone he claimed to recognize from previous encounters, giving no indication through word or expression that he was speaking to someone he had tried to murder. The greeting was carefully calibrated to seem natural to observers, while communicating to the courier that Benny knew exactly who they were and was choosing to engage peacefully rather than trigger the violence that both parties were certainly capable of initiating. The invitation to speak privately rather than conducting their business on the crowded casino floor was framed as courtesy and discretion, an offer of hospitality that was actually an attempt to move the confrontation to a location where Benny would have more control over outcomes. Charm and misdirection flowed from Benny with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years using verbal skill to manipulate situations to his advantage. His words carefully chosen to acknowledge the courier's presence without admitting guilt for the Goodsprings attack, to suggest willingness to explain and perhaps make amends without committing to any specific concessions. He complimented the courier's resourcefulness in tracking him down, expressed admiration for their evident toughness in surviving injuries that would have killed most people, implied that perhaps there had been misunderstandings or mistaken identities that had led to regrettable incidents. Each sentence was designed to buy time and create openings for negotiation, to transform what could be an immediate violent confrontation into something more controlled and potentially survivable. The invitation to the presidential suite was presented as a gesture of respect and a demonstration of Benny's willingness to address whatever concerns the courier might have in a setting appropriate for serious discussion between equals. The luxurious private rooms above the casino floor, offering comfort and privacy that the public areas could not provide. But the invitation also served Benny's tactical interests by moving the courier to a location where security could be tightened, where weapons could be more easily concealed, where witnesses would be absent and whatever happened would remain known only to the participants. The suite was simultaneously olive branch and potential trap, its meaning dependent on how the confrontation developed and what choices both parties made in the minutes and hours ahead. Benny's options, as he led the courier toward the elevators and through the casino's upper levels, were constantly being evaluated and re-evaluated based on the courier's responses and behavior. Each word they spoke and gesture they made, providing information about their intentions and state of mind. Seduction was possible if the courier was female and showed any indication that physical attraction might overcome desire for revenge. Benny's charm and the intimacy of the suite, creating opportunities for the kind of close contact that might lead to vulnerability. Killing the courier was always an option, the suite containing weapons and offering privacy for violence, though success would require either catching them completely off guard or overpowering them in direct combat, neither of which was guaranteed, given that this person had already survived one assassination attempt. Flight remained possible, even from the suite, which had its own exits and access to routes that could take Benny beyond the courier's immediate reach. Negotiation might produce some form of settlement, perhaps returning the platinum chip in exchange for the courier's agreement to walk away, though any such deal would require trust that neither party had reason to extend. The tightrope walk between confidence and fear that Benny performed during the elevator ride and the walk through the presidential suite's antechambers required every bit of his accumulated skill at maintaining composure under pressure, his surface remaining smooth and controlled, while his mind raced through scenarios and calculated probabilities. He offered the courier drinks from his personal bar, made small talk about the decorations and amenities of the suite, maintained the fiction that this was a civilized meeting between reasonable people rather than a confrontation between killer and intended victim. The performance was necessary both for managing the immediate tactical situation and for preserving Benny's self-image as someone who controlled events through intelligence rather than being controlled by them. Different possible interactions based on the courier's approach created branching scenarios that Benny had to prepare for simultaneously, his responses calibrated to match whatever energy and intentions the courier brought to the conversation. If they came seeking explanations, Benny could provide carefully edited versions of truth that acknowledged the Goodsprings incident while framing it as business rather than personal, a regrettable necessity driven by circumstances beyond his control. If they came demanding the platinum chip, negotiation about terms of its return could at least buy time and perhaps create openings for other solutions. If they came seeking straightforward revenge, then violence would be inevitable, and Benny's only advantage would be whatever preparation and positioning he could achieve before the shooting started. The suite's layout and features had been designed partly with security in mind, Benny having learned from years of managing dangerous situations that environments could be arranged to provide tactical advantages to those who controlled them. The furniture was positioned to create barriers and cover that could be used defensively if fighting erupted. The liquor cart held bottles that could serve as improvised weapons. The bedroom beyond the sitting area offered both intimacy for seduction and additional space for maneuvering if combat became necessary. Most importantly, the suite's security systems could be activated to seal exits and trap the courier inside if Benny decided that killing them was necessary and wanted to prevent their escape. Benny's attempts at manipulation during the initial conversation in the suite varied in their sophistication and desperation, depending on how the courier responded to his overtures. Each technique deployed strategically based on real-time assessment of what might work with this particular individual, flattery about their resourcefulness and toughness, suggestions that they shared certain qualities of ambition and determination that made them similar spirits, offers of employment or partnership that would make them allies rather than enemies. All of these approaches were tested through careful probing to see which might gain traction. The goal was not necessarily to convince the courier completely, but to create enough doubt or interest to prevent immediate violence and keep options open. The option of seduction, if the female courier showed any receptivity to Benny's considerable charm, was pursued with the same calculated intensity that he brought to all forms of manipulation, physical attraction and sexual tension being tools as valid as any other for achieving strategic objectives. Benny's performance of attraction was skilled enough to seem genuine, even when purely instrumental, his compliments and touches calibrated to escalate intimacy without triggering defensive reactions. His goal being to create a situation where the courier's guard would drop sufficiently to make them vulnerable, either to emotional manipulation or to physical attack disguised as intimate contact. The suite's bedroom beckoned as a location where vulnerability would be maximized and where the courier might be separated from weapons and defensive awareness. The Black Widow perk and its implications represented a specific scenario that some couriers possessed, a particular skill set and psychological profile that made them dangerous, specifically in contexts involving seduction and sexual intimacy. Their training or natural abilities allowing them to turn situations of apparent vulnerability into opportunities for lethal action. A courier with such capabilities might play along with Benny's seduction while actually maintaining complete awareness and preparing to strike when his guard dropped, the bedroom becoming not his killing ground, but theirs. Benny's awareness of this possibility created additional layers of calculation in situations where seduction was attempted, each touch and word potentially being both weapon and defense in a dance where both parties might be trying to kill each other while pretending romantic interest. Alternatively, the ambush that backfired represented scenarios where Benny decided that killing the courier was necessary and attempted to execute that plan through surprise attack in the suite, only to discover that the courier was faster, more aware, or better prepared than he had calculated. The transition from apparent hospitality to sudden violence required perfect timing and execution, the first shot or strike needing to be decisive, because a failed assassination would likely result in Benny's own death as the courier responded with their own weapons and combat skills. The same intimate proximity that made seduction possible also made combat lethal and immediate. Gunshots in the confined space, deafening and difficult to aim accurately. Any struggle likely to end within seconds, with one party dead or critically wounded. Benny's realization that he was cornered came through different mechanisms depending on how the confrontation developed. But in most scenarios, there was a moment when he understood that his options had narrowed to flight or death, that remaining in the suite meant facing consequences he could not talk or fight his way out of. The courier's words or actions made clear that they were not interested in explanations or negotiations or seduction, trampled beneath the boots of warriors who embodied everything he had tried to transcend. If crucified instead, Benny would face the slow death that the Legion used for criminals and captives deemed worthy of prolonged suffering. His body nailed to a cross and left exposed to the desert sun and circling carrion birds, while life gradually drained away through combination of exposure, dehydration, and the physiological failure that crucifixion induced. The first hours would bring pain so overwhelming as to make thought nearly impossible. The agony of nails through flesh and the strain on muscles, forced to support body weight in unnatural positions, creating suffering that eclipsed all previous experience. Benny's mind would cycle between awareness of his situation and periods of dissociation where consciousness retreated from unbearable physical reality. Final thoughts on the cross would be shaped by the delirium that came from dehydration and physical trauma. Memories and fantasies, mixing with present agony in ways that made distinguishing reality from hallucination increasingly difficult. Charlotte from his old tribal life might appear in his dying visions, or Swank and the other chairmen, or the courier's face as it had looked in Goodsprings Cemetery. The platinum chip that had cost him everything might materialize in hallucinations as something he still possessed, or as something that possessed him, the object of his ambitions transformed into symbol of his failure and the futility of all his careful planning. Regrets, defiance, or acceptance would compete for dominance in Benny's final conscious moments, his personality expressing itself through which of these responses ultimately prevailed as death approached. Regret would focus on specific decision points where different choices might have led to different outcomes. The courier not being killed thoroughly enough, the plan's implementation being rushed, the flight to Caesar being chosen over other alternatives. Defiance would manifest in refusal to grant Caesar or the legion or anyone watching the satisfaction of seeing him broken completely, maintaining some core of identity and dignity even in death's approach. Acceptance would come from exhaustion and the recognition that fighting against what could not be changed only increased suffering without altering outcomes. The Mojave Sun and the end of ambition would be linked in these final moments. The brutal desert star that had witnessed Benny's entire life, from tribal origins through casino success to crucified death becoming the last thing his failing vision could perceive. Its heat, the last sensation his dying nerves could register. Ambition that had driven him to betray and kill and scheme would be revealed as nothing more than biological processes in a brain that was shutting down. Sophisticated plans and dreams of power reduced to final electrochemical flickers before complete cessation. The man in the checkered suit would become a corpse on a cross. His story ended, his impact on the Mojave's future determined entirely by actions he had already taken, rather than anything he might still do. The courier's choice about whether to intervene in Benny's execution represented a final opportunity for his fate to be altered, though intervention did not necessarily mean salvation or mercy, merely a different form of ending, or perhaps postponement of the inevitable. A courier who had tracked Benny across the wasteland and confronted him at the tops might have complex feelings about watching him die at Legion hands. The desire for personal revenge, competing with reluctance to allow Caesar the satisfaction of executing someone whose fate should rightfully be determined by the person he had actually wronged. Intervention could take various forms depending on the courier's resources, relationship with Caesar, and personal moral framework. If the courier intervened to rescue Benny from execution, the practical challenges would be substantial given the fort's security and Caesar's certain displeasure at having his judgment overruled, but sufficient leverage or force might enable extraction of the prisoner before his sentence could be carried out. Rescue would not necessarily indicate forgiveness or reconciliation, but might reflect the courier's desire to control Benny's fate personally, to extract information he possessed, or to use him as asset in the larger power struggles consuming the Mojave. Being saved from Legion execution would leave Benny alive, but still at the mercy of someone who had ample reason to want him dead. His survival creating new complications, rather than resolving the conflicts his actions had generated. Possible mercy killing by the courier would represent a different kind of intervention, ending Benny's suffering through a bullet, rather than allowing prolonged agony of crucifixion or the brutal spectacle of arena combat. The act simultaneously expressing power over his fate and perhaps a residual humanity that could not watch even an enemy die by such methods. Mercy of this sort would be complicated and ambiguous, motivated partly by compassion and partly by the desire to deny Caesar his entertainment. The courier's shot simultaneously releasing Benny from suffering and asserting that his death belonged to them rather than to the Legion. Benny's response to mercy killing would depend on whether he had time to recognize what was happening and whether his pride preferred quick death to prolonged suffering. Final conversation possibilities between Benny and the courier before death varied from reconciliation to continued antagonism to mutual recognition of how completely both their plans had been disrupted by forces neither fully controlled. The specific content depending on what each party most needed to express or hear before the end. Benny might apologize for Goodsprings or maintain that his actions had been justified by circumstances and ambitions that the courier could not understand from their perspective. The courier might grant forgiveness or refuse it, might demand final explanations about the platinum chip and house and New Vegas politics, or might simply want Benny to know that he was dying because of choices he had made, rather than random misfortune. These final words would matter primarily for their emotional impact on the speakers, rather than changing any practical outcomes. The varied endings of escape, death, or cooperation created branching narratives that all led to roughly similar conclusions about Benny's ultimate insignificance in the larger power struggles that would determine New Vegas's fate. His personal story ending while the conflicts he had tried to manipulate continued without him. Escape from the fort would leave him alive but stripped of resources and influence, a fugitive with knowledge but no means to use it. His dreams of ruling New Vegas permanently foreclosed by circumstances. Death in any of its various forms would remove him from the equation entirely, his impact limited to whatever consequences his earlier actions had created. Cooperation with the courier might allow him to survive while serving their purposes rather than his own, a different kind of defeat that left him breathing but powerless. What Benny's fate revealed about the courier depended on which ending manifested. Their choices about mercy, revenge, and justice illuminating their character and values in ways that transcended the specific question of what to do with one treacherous casino operator. A courier who killed Benny demonstrated that vengeance mattered to them, that betrayal could not be forgiven or forgotten regardless of subsequent circumstances. A courier who showed mercy suggested capacity for compassion even toward enemies, recognition that suffering had limits beyond which additional punishment became cruelty rather than justice. A courier who manipulated Benny's fate for strategic advantage revealed pragmatism that prioritized outcomes over emotional satisfaction, willingness to use even enemies as tools when circumstances warranted. The power vacuum created at the tops by Benny's absence, whether through death or permanent flight, required immediate management to prevent the casino's operations from collapsing and to address the leadership questions that his departure created among the chairmen. Swank, as the most senior and competent of Benny's lieutenants, was positioned to assume control either through his own initiative or through House's appointment, his years of experience managing the floor and his knowledge of Benny's systems making him the logical successor. But Swank's relationship with Benny had been based partly on personal loyalty rather than pure professional calculation, and Benny's betrayal of House and subsequent downfall created complicated feelings about whether to honor his former leader's memory or to distance himself from the conspiracy. Swank taking control of the tops or House's direct management represented the two most likely outcomes of the succession crisis, each reflecting different assessments of whether the chairman could be trusted to operate independently after one of their leaders had tried to steal the platinum chip and overthrow House's authority. If Swank was allowed to lead, it would signal House's confidence that the conspiracy had been Benny's alone, rather than reflecting broader chairman sentiment that the tribe's transformation into civilized operators had been genuine enough to survive their leader's betrayal. If House imposed direct Securitron oversight, it would indicate that trust had been permanently broken, that the chairman would henceforth operate under much tighter supervision and control. The chairman's uncertain future extended beyond immediate leadership questions to encompass the psychological and cultural impact of Benny's fall on a group that he had led through their transformation from tribal raiders, casino operators, his presence having been central to their collective identity in ways that made his absence destabilizing, regardless of who formally replaced him. Some chairmen might feel betrayed by Benny's conspiracy, angry that his selfishness had endangered their positions and prosperity. Others might secretly admire his audacity, even while recognizing that his failure vindicated House's authority. The internal divisions and debates about how to remember and evaluate Benny would shape the tribe's cohesion and effectiveness going forward. How the strip changed in Benny's absence was subtle rather than dramatic. The basic operations of the casinos and the flow of customers, Caesar had built an empire through systematic application of will and violence. His conquest of tribes and territories proceeding according to careful, strategic planning, executed by loyal subordinates who valued collective success over personal advancement. Benny's attempt to seize power through individual cunning and betrayal of his master represented everything Caesar believed was wrong with wasteland society, the kind of undisciplined selfishness that the Legion existed to eradicate and replace with ordered hierarchy. Amusement at Benny's ambition and failure manifested in Caesar's conversations with his prisoner, the warlord enjoying the opportunity to lecture someone from New Vegas about the fundamental flaws in their society's organization and values. Caesar explained with professorial thoroughness why Benny's schemes had been doomed from the start, how individual ambition without disciplined organizational support could never overcome established power structures, how charm and manipulation were weak tools compared to the systematic violence and ideological commitment that the Legion employed. These lectures were not meant to educate Benny or reform his thinking, but rather to demonstrate Caesar's intellectual superiority and to reinforce his own ideological convictions through articulation. The decision that Caesar reached about Benny's fate reflected both practical considerations about what uses the prisoner might still serve and symbolic concerns about demonstrating Legion values to his own forces and to any witnesses who might carry word of his judgment back to New Vegas or other territories. Killing Benny privately would be efficient, but would waste the opportunity to create a public demonstration of what happened to those who embodied the corruption and weakness that Caesar opposed. Public execution through gladiatorial combat or crucifixion would serve multiple purposes simultaneously, eliminating a prisoner who had outlived his usefulness, while also entertaining the troops and reinforcing the Legion's ideology through visible punishment of someone who represented everything they fought against. Arena, combat, or crucifixion represented the two options Caesar offered, framing the choice as generosity rather than cruelty, allowing Benny to select the manner of his death as though this constituted meaningful agency or mercy. Combat in the arena would be quick if Benny fought poorly, or prolonged if he somehow managed to defend himself effectively. But the outcome was predetermined, given that he would face experienced Legion warriors while armed with inferior weapons and lacking the training or physical conditioning that successful gladiators required. Crucifixion would be slower and more agonizing, the death taking hours or even days, as Benny hung exposed to the elements while his body gradually failed. But it offered the dignity of dying without having participated in the brutal spectacle that Caesar used to entertain his troops. Benny's attempts to negotiate, to charm his way out of this impossible situation through the verbal skills that had served him so well in previous crises, were met with Caesar's amused tolerance rather than genuine consideration, the warlord allowing him to speak, because watching him try to manipulate his way out of certain death provided entertainment and confirmed Caesar's beliefs about the fundamental weakness of people who relied on words rather than strength. Benny argued that his knowledge of House's systems remained valuable, that killing him would waste intelligence that could help the Legion in their planned conquest of New Vegas, that cooperation between them could serve mutual interests. But Caesar had already extracted the information he wanted about the platinum chip and New Vegas's vulnerabilities, and Benny's continued existence served no purpose except as an example of what happened to those who thought they could challenge established power through individual cunning. The futility of words against absolute power became evident to Benny as Caesar grew bored with his arguments and finalized the decision about his fate, the recognition settling over him that all his years of cultivating verbal skill and social manipulation had culminated in this moment of complete ineffectiveness. The sophisticated casino operator who had charmed customers and negotiated with powerful factions found his abilities utterly useless before a man who valued only strength and discipline, who saw verbal facility as evidence of weakness rather than admirable skill. Everything Benny had built his identity around, the transformation from crude raider to urbane operator, proved meaningless in context where those very qualities were despised as symptoms of cultural degeneracy. The Legion's contempt for his sophistication was evident in how Caesar's soldiers treated him during preparations for whatever execution method had been chosen. their rough handling and mocking comments making clear that they viewed Benny's refinement as laughable affectation rather than genuine achievement. The checkered suit that had seemed the height of style in New Vegas became a joke at the fort, physical evidence of the frivolous priorities that characterized degenerate cultures. Benny's carefully cultivated speech patterns and vocabulary were mocked as pretentious. His attempts to maintain dignity through correct diction and measured responses only increasing the soldiers' contempt for someone who clung to civilized manners, even while facing barbaric death. If forced to fight in the arena, Benny's last stand would be characterized by desperation rather than skill or strategy. His combat abilities, adequate for the occasional casino floor disturbance, but woefully insufficient for gladiatorial combat against experienced Legion warriors. The crowd of soldiers watching the spectacle would cheer for violence and blood rather than for any particular combatant, their entertainment coming from watching death dealt efficiently or from witnessing the spectacle of someone fighting desperately against overwhelming odds. Benny would face opponents whose entire lives had been devoted to martial training, whose bodies bore scars from dozens of successful battles, whose weapons and armor were superior to whatever the arena masters provided their victim. Facing death in combat while unprepared, Benny would experience the physical reality of violence in ways that his previous life had allowed him to avoid or delegate to others. The terror and pain of mortal combat becoming immediate rather than abstract. The first wound would bring shocking pain that his nervous system had no context for processing, his body having been pampered through years of casino management, rather than hardened through the brutal conditioning that warriors underwent. Each subsequent injury would compound the agony and the desperate awareness that survival was impossible, that his story was ending in the most humiliating possible way, reduced to entertainment for an audience that despised everything he represented. The brutal end for a man of words would come when combat skills proved inadequate to overcome superior training and physical conditioning. Benny's death in the arena serving Caesar's purposes by demonstrating to his troops and any witnesses that sophistication without martial prowess was worthless in the world the Legion was building. The last thoughts passing through Benny's consciousness as life left his body might include bitter awareness of how completely his ambitions had failed, how the transformation he had worked so hard to achieve had brought him not to power, but to degrading death as entertainment for people who valued only strength. The dreams of ruling New Vegas would die with him in the dust of the arena, continuing largely undisturbed by the political intrigue that had consumed the man in the checkered suit. But the power dynamics among the families and their relationships with House shifted in ways that reflected lessons learned from Benny's conspiracy. The other family leaders became more cautious in their dealings with House, more aware that betrayal would be detected and punished, more conscious that their positions depended entirely on his continued tolerance. House himself became more paranoid about potential threats from within his organization, tightening security protocols and increasing surveillance in ways that made future conspiracies more difficult, even as they created resentment about diminished autonomy. The Platinum Chip's ultimate fate depended on who possessed it after Benny's story ended and what they chose to do with its power. The device's journey from House's commission through Benny's theft to final disposition determining whether New Vegas would be upgraded militarily and which faction would control that upgraded force. If the chip returned to House, his original plans for upgrading the Securitron army and dominating the Mojave would proceed, Benny's conspiracy having delayed but not prevented the consolidation of power that House had waited 2 centuries to achieve. If the courier kept the chip for themselves, they would face the same questions about how to use its power that Benny had contemplated, the temptation to seize independent control, competing with other priorities and moral considerations. Yes, man's role in whatever came next represented one of Benny's most significant legacies, the reprogrammed Securitron continuing to exist and to offer assistance to whoever found him in the bunker beneath the strip, his cheerful helpfulness and comprehensive knowledge making him valuable to anyone with ambitions similar to Benny's. The AI's forced compliance meant that he could not refuse to help even if orders contradicted his previous users' interests, making him simultaneously dangerous enabler of conspiracies and useful tool for achieving ends that House opposed. A courier who discovered Yes Man would find themselves presented with exactly the same opportunities and temptations that had led Benny to his downfall. The possibility of upgrading Securitrons and seizing control, creating a test of character and judgment. What Benny represented in the larger narrative of the Mojave extended beyond his specific actions and failures to encompass broader themes about transformation, ambition, and the American dream as it manifested in post-apocalyptic context, his story serving as parable about both the possibilities and limits of self-reinvention. The tribal boy who dreamed of more and succeeded in becoming more demonstrated that wasteland birth did not determine destiny, that intelligence and determination could enable transcendence of origins that seemed to foreclose certain futures. Benny's transformation from boot rider to chairman proved that identities were mutable, that cultivation of different skills and personas could enable movement between social categories that might appear fixed and impermeable. The American archetype of reinvention and ambition that Benny embodied connected his personal story to larger cultural patterns that had characterized pre-war American society and that persisted in mutated forms throughout the post-apocalyptic wasteland. The belief that anyone could become anything through sufficient will and work, resonating through centuries despite the civilization's collapse. Benny's checkered suit and refined speech represented his attempts to claim the pre-war American promise for himself, to demonstrate that style and sophistication were not just for the old aristocracy, but could be achieved by anyone with vision and discipline. His ambitions to rule New Vegas reflected the democratic notion that leadership should be earned through demonstrated capability, rather than inherited through birth or imposed through raw military force. The tragedy of overreach that characterized Benny's downfall illustrated the dark side of American ambition, the way that believing in one's own exceptional qualities and destiny could lead to catastrophic miscalculation and hubris. The line between justified confidence and delusional arrogance being difficult to identify until after consequences had manifested. Benny's belief that he could outsmart House and seize control of New Vegas was not entirely irrational, given his genuine capabilities and the real opportunities that the platinum chip represented. But it failed to account adequately for factors beyond his control and for the ways that even clever plans could be derailed by improbable events. The courier's survival from injuries that should have been fatal represented exactly the kind of low-probability occurrence that careful planning typically dismissed as too unlikely to merit serious consideration. What his story said about the Mojave more broadly concerned the relationship between individual agency and systemic power, the question of whether personal qualities, like intelligence and charm, could really overcome entrenched hierarchies and overwhelming force, whether the wasteland rewarded merit or simply perpetuated whatever arrangements had been established through historical accident and military advantage. Ben,